The afternoon sun streamed through the large glass windows of Brooks Tech, where the towering New York City skyline contrasted with the soft blue sky. Logan Brooks, the company's CEO, barely looked away from his computer as he pored over detailed reports. He embodied ambition, known for his unwavering perfectionism and his strict control over every detail of his business. Few dared to interrupt him, and those who did were usually met with a sharp look from his intense eyes. The only person who knew how to handle him up close was Emily Lawson, his personal secretary and right hand. For the past 8 years, Emily had been by his side, organizing every aspect of his professional life with meticulous precision and unmatched dedication. She was the bridge between Logan's world and the rest of the team, responsible for softening the impact of his demanding personality. Whenever something went wrong, she corrected it, even if he never gave her credit for it. That afternoon, Emily entered the room silently, closing the door behind her with care. She carried a folder with documents he needed to review before an important meeting. Logan glanced up briefly, nodding for her to place the papers on his desk. Without a word, she set down the documents but hesitated before leaving. Logan sensed the pause, his gaze returning to her. "Anything else, Emily?" he asked, raising an eyebrow slightly, showing his usual impatience. She took a deep breath and, standing firm, announced, "Yes, Mr. Brooks. I need to discuss something important with you." There was an unusual calm in her voice, a tone that made him frown, then speak up. "I have a meeting in 10 minutes. He was clearly irritated, but there was something in Emily's look that unsettled him. "I'm handing in my resignation, sir," she stated directly, extending a white envelope on the table. Logan's expression remained unchanged, but the tension in his shoulders became noticeably more pronounced. He took the envelope without haste, his eyes fixed on her as if trying to decipher her intentions. "Emily, I'm not sure I heard that right." He tried to contain his disbelief, but the discomfort in his voice was evident. "I'm resigning, sir," she repeated, with surprising calmness, maintaining eye contact with him. There was a slight tremor in her hands, but she remained poised, determined to follow through with her decision. For a moment, Logan was silent, his eyes assessing every detail of Emily's expression, as if waiting for her to burst into laughter and confess that it was all a joke. But the seriousness in her eyes indicated otherwise. He placed the envelope on the table without opening it. 8 years working by my side, Emily, and now you decide to leave without any prior notice?" She sighed, expecting this response. "I understand that it may seem sudden, Mr. Brooks, but I've been considering this for some time. This isn't an impulsive decision. It's not impulsive?" he repeated sarcastically, crossing his arms. "Let me understand. You decided that after almost a decade, you simply want to leave?" "That's right," she replied, keeping a neutral tone, though she felt her nerves rising. "I want to go in a different direction. I have my own plans now." Logan gave a short laugh, but there was restrained frustration in his eyes. "Emily, do you know what you're doing? Do you know the impact your decision will have on the company? You'll be causing chaos in my schedule. This is selfish." His voice was low, but each word was loaded with tension. She hesitated for a moment, but knew she couldn't allow him to intimidate her. "I understand the importance of my role, Mr. Brooks, and I know the timing might not be ideal. But after 8 years, I think it's fair to say that I've done my duty. Now it's time to take care of myself." Logan stared at her, clearly shaken by her statement. Emily had always been his constant, the person who understood his way of working without him needing to explain. He considered her essential, even if he had never expressed it in words. "I don't accept your resignation, Emily," he said finally, as if it were a simple matter of choice. "You know what to do. Put that envelope away and keep doing your job." Emily almost laughed at his response. It was clear he believed that his mere will could keep her there forever, but not this time. She shook her head gently, "Mr. Brooks, with all due respect, I'm not asking for your permission. I'm simply informing you of my decision." The silence that followed was thick, as if the whole room had frozen. Logan watched her with an intensity that made her hesitate for a brief moment. He had never had to worry about what she thought or felt, and this indifference had been comfortable for them both for years. But now, she was breaking this dynamic irrevocably. "Emily, this is absurd," he began, without hiding his irritation. "Why are you doing this now? What happened for you to decide to leave? I pay well, I offer benefits. If it's a raise you want, I can provide it." She shook her head again. "It's not that. The issue isn't the salary or the benefits. It's just me. I need something different." He let out an exasperated sigh and looked away, clearly disturbed by the lack of control over the situation. "Have you thought about the impact this will have? Emily, you're essential to this company, and I need you." The sincerity in his words caught her off guard, but she tried not to let it affect her. "I appreciate that, Mr. Brooks, but if the company truly needs me, then it also needs to learn to move forward without me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Logan seemed to assess the situation, probably thinking of every possible way to keep her there. Emily, on the other hand, felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. She had never imagined that leaving that office would be so difficult, but at the same time, she needed to fight for what she truly wanted. "So that's it?" he finally asked, his voice carrying an emotion she had never heard before. "Yes, that's it," she replied, without averting her gaze. He looked at the envelope still untouched on the table, as if he could alter the course of events simply by ignoring that piece of paper. The silence between them lasted a few seconds until he finally looked up at her. "Very well, Emily, but let me be clear. I'm not going to make your departure easy. If this is what you want, then you'll have to face the consequences. From now on, you're on my radar." She nodded, accepting the challenge but feeling a pang of fear. She knew Logan Brooks wasn't a man who gave up easily. "Understood, Mr. Brooks." She left the office in silence, but as soon as she closed the door behind her, she let out a sigh of relief. It was the first step towards something new, and although she felt fearful, she also experienced a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in a long time. The pressure of years working alongside a boss who demanded everything without offering anything in return was finally beginning to lift. Logan, on the other side of the door, remained seated, staring at the envelope. The thought of losing Emily bothered him more than he wanted to admit. She had been a constant in his life and in the company's routine. Deep down, he knew he had underestimated how much he relied on her, and the prospect of not having her by his side was almost unimaginable. Anger and wounded pride consumed him, but something deeper was beginning to surface. Whatever it was, he wasn't ready to face it yet. That night, alone in the office, Logan picked up the envelope for the first time. In his hands, that piece of paper felt heavier than any important document he had ever held. Reluctantly, he opened it and read Emily's resignation letter, the formality and simplicity of her words almost irritating him. There was no explanation, no reason beyond wanting to move on. But he knew there was more, and for the first time, he felt challenged by someone. That night, he decided he wouldn't let Emily go so easily. The following day, tension was palpable in the Brooks tech office. Logan Brooks, usually composed and confident, moved with unusual impatience. As he paced between his office and the assistants area, the rest of the team could sense his restless energy. Everyone knew something was off, but no one dared to ask. Emily, as always, was stationed at her desk outside his office, her expression calm as she organized documents and responded to emails as if nothing had changed. Yet, her resignation was far from forgotten by Logan. It dominated his every thought. Once again, he called her into his office. "Emily, bring today's schedule," he commanded with his usual direct tone, but a noticeable tension laced his voice. She entered and positioned herself before his desk, opening the agenda with absolute professionalism. Logan, however, couldn't focus on the appointments. Instead, he watched her, his intense gaze searching for a sign, a clue that her decision might be temporary. Amar Brooks. "We begin with the board meeting at 9 o'clock, she stated, holding her ground. Logan nodded, but before she could continue, he leaned forward, his eyes locked on her. "Emily, are you all right?" "You seem tired," he said, his voice almost casual, but there was strategy behind his words. She took a deep breath, fully aware that this was just the first of many tactics he would likely try. "I'm fine, thank you for asking," she replied, without pretense. Logan gave a faint smile, but it was not one of kindness. It was the smile of someone unwilling to be opposed. "If you need more time off, just let me know. You know your well-being is important to me and to the company." Emily knew he was playing his cards. She knew him well enough to see that he wasn't truly concerned about her health. He was simply trying a different angle. "I appreciate it, Mr. Brooks, but my decision isn't about needing rest. This is something I have to do for myself." He was silent for a few moments. "If you think you deserve a raise, then maybe we should discuss a salary renegotiation. I believe your dedication and years of service deserve recognition." She felt a twinge of frustration. Logan had never brought up her salary before, almost as if he knew she cared more about personal growth than financial gain. "Thank you for the offer, but money isn't the reason," she replied, her voice calm, almost gentle. Logan tried to mask his growing irritation. "Then explain it to me, Emily. Why now? Why, after years of dedication, do you decide to simply walk away?" Emily took a deep breath, knowing this conversation would be a long one, but resolved to stand her ground. "Logan, after so many years, I realized I also need time for myself. I want to discover what I truly want, rather than just meeting someone else's needs." Her answer seemed to unsettle him further. "That's ungrateful, you know. I offered you a stable position, benefits, and a salary above the industry average. And for 8 years, you accepted it all. Now, suddenly, you think you can just leave it all behind? Emily, do you understand the impact this will have on my routine, on the company? Are you aware of that?" Emily remained steady, though each word from him aimed to put her on the defensive. "Yes, I understand the impact my departure will have, but I also know the company will manage without me. You'll find someone to fill the role. Brooks Tech is much larger than any one of us. It's not just about filling a position," he replied, his voice louder than usual. "It's about trust, about the partnership we've built. You are more than just an employee to me." She bit her tongue to avoid responding with anger, keeping her composure. "Maybe if you had shown that before, Mr. Brooks, I wouldn't need to make this decision now." His expression changed for a brief moment. Her straightforward response caught him off guard, but he didn't want to admit that his actions or lack of recognition might have influenced her decision. Instead, he took a deep breath, seeking a new approach. "Emily, I'm not going to accept your resignation until you give me a logical and convincing explanation. This vague reasoning isn't enough." She didn't know whether to laugh at his stubborn attitude or feel indignant. "With all due respect, Mr. Brooks, my decision doesn't need your approval. I'm simply here to finish my last tasks and facilitate the transition." He clenched his fists but kept his posture upright, his austere expression intimidating to anyone nearby. "If you're so determined, then explain what these new plans of yours are. I want to understand what's so important that it's making you leave me." Emily considered for a moment. Part of her wanted to open up, but she knew Logan wouldn't fully understand. "It's not about you or the company, it's just personal. I want to give myself the chance to explore new opportunities, to understand who I am outside of this office." He watched her in silence, his eyes reflecting a mix of frustration and surprise. He had always thought of her as predictable, almost an extension of himself. It had never occurred to him that she might have her own ambitions, or that they could be more important than the work they shared. "You're making a mistake," he stated confidently. "Maybe," she replied without hesitation. "But it's a risk I'm willing to take." Throughout the rest of the week, Logan showed no sign of accepting her decision. Each day, he tried a new tactic. One morning, he sent flowers to her desk, a gesture he had never done before, almost as if he were courting an important client. In the afternoon, he called her in for a casual meeting that turned into an attempt to probe her future plans. But Emily answered all his questions with neutrality. Finally, Logan began to lose patience, and in a later conversation, he tried to make her see how her departure would be a blow to the company. He spoke about the impact on each department, even mentioning possible delays in major projects. Emily, however, didn't back down. Her responses were always calm but firm, and with each of her refusals, he became more insistent. At the end of the day on Friday, when everyone had already left, Logan approached her desk, hoping the emptier environment might make her less defensive. He leaned over the divider that separated her desk from the main office area, watching her with an intensity that made her feel slightly uneasy. "Emily," he began, his tone softer than usual. "If there's anything I can do to make you change your mind, anything, please tell me." She looked at him, surprised by the conciliatory tone. It was rare to hear a request from him, let alone one that carried an almost pleading tone. But still, she didn't change her stance. "Logan, I've already made my decision. Please understand that this isn't a request for improvements. It's a life decision." He shook his head, a sarcastic smile on his lips. "I understand. You think you can find something better out there. But let me tell you something, Emily. Out there, the market is competitive, and not everyone will be as understanding as I am. Think carefully about what you're leaving behind." She almost felt pity for him at that moment, as she knew that no matter how he tried to keep up his arrogant facade, deep down he was lost, unsure of how to handle the situation. And this was the first moment she truly knew that Logan wasn't invincible. He was human, just as susceptible to loss as anyone else. Gradually, Logan began to realize he might not actually be able to keep her there. It was an idea he couldn't accept, but one that was becoming inevitable, and his initial anger was giving way to an unfamiliar sense of anguish. Emily was a central part of his work life. She knew every detail of his routine and shielded him from the unexpected, which he despised. He wondered what it would be like the day he couldn't call out her name for assistance or know. Someone was always there to take care of his needs. This thought terrified him, but he would never say it aloud. Logan decided that, starting that night, he would study one final strategy. He would seek to understand Emily more deeply, to discover what she truly wanted from life outside the office, and perhaps use this information to his advantage. He knew that if anyone could convince Emily to stay, it would be him. That night, she left the office exhausted but relieved. She noticed that he was slowly giving in, even if he wouldn't admit it. She knew he was battling against what he saw as an act of rebellion and wanted to turn it into another of his power games. But this time, the game was hers, and she was determined to see it through to the end. That evening, the atmosphere in the Italian restaurant was warm and inviting, with soft lights hanging from the ceiling and the tempting aroma of basil and parmesan filling the air. Logan and Emily sat at a discreet table in a quiet corner, away from the bustling center of the place. It was a strictly professional outing, at least. That's what he insisted when he invited her. He knew he couldn't force her to come, but he disguised the invitation as a necessary discussion of the details for a new project they were developing. Emily accepted, but as she approached the restaurant, she couldn't shake the tension that grew within her. Why had he insisted on a work dinner in such a place? Any alignment could have been done at the office. Deep down, she sensed that there was a less practical purpose behind it all and wondered just how far he was willing to go to keep her at Brooks Tech. When they arrived, Logan, as always impeccably dressed, settled in with a confident smile. He started the conversation in a casual tone, unusual for someone who usually was sharp and direct. "Do you know this place, Emily?" "It's one of my favorites." She shook her head politely. "I've never been here before, Mr. Brooks," she replied, uncertain how to navigate this unfamiliar territory. Around them, tables full of couples and friends chatting made the situation feel even more uncomfortable. Logan's easygoing demeanor was intriguing, as if he were simply with an old friend. But Emily knew he was a master at hiding his intentions. Logan handed her the menu, pointing out a few options while casually discussing the quality of the food. Emily was attentive, but her own thoughts weighed her down. She could barely remember the last time she'd gone out to dinner with someone for something other than work. The past few years had been a whirlwind of tasks and obligations to keep her professional and financial life stable. The thought brought a pang of regret and nostalgia, but she pushed it away to focus on the present. Once their meals were served, Logan, after a few moments of light conversation, decided to address the question that had plagued him since she'd handed in her resignation. "Emily," he began, looking at her directly, "8 years by my side, always handling everything. Then suddenly, you want to drop it all and leave. I'd like to understand. This isn't just curiosity. I genuinely need to know why." She hesitated, but something about the way he asked prompted her to open up a little. It was hard to ignore the sincerity and almost vulnerability in his tone, a rare trait for someone as controlling as Logan. "They're just things I want to do. Personal experiences," she replied, surprised at her own honesty. "It's not that I dislike my job, but there are things I've put off for so long that I almost forgot about them." He nodded, watching her with more attentiveness than ever. "Like what?" Emily laughed softly, trying to ease the tension. "Oh, you wouldn't understand. Just things on my list." Logan raised an eyebrow. "List?" She swallowed, realizing she'd let slip more than she intended. "Yes. Things I want to do before I turn 30. She looked away, trying to divert the focus, but she felt his gaze, unwavering and curious, fixed on her. "Emily," he said, leaning slightly forward, his tone soft but full of determination, "if there's a list that needs fulfilling, maybe I can help. But you know you can accomplish those things without needing to leave, right?" She chuckled, uncomfortable with his offer. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks, but I don't think my personal goals fall under the scope of work." He leaned back in his chair, assessing her. The thought of seeing Emily so determined to leave unsettled him, but it also sparked a curiosity about something he'd never cared to know, who Emily was beyond the efficient secretary. "Maybe I'll be surprised," he murmured, as if accepting a challenge. "So what's on this list anyway? Exotic trips? Skydiving? Meeting celebrities?" He was teasing, but his curiosity was genuine, and the provocation was an attempt to break down her defenses. Emily hesitated, but, sensing he wouldn't give up easily, decided to share a little. "Some things are adventurous, yes, but others are simpler. For example, I want to learn to surf. I've always dreamed of it, but never found the time or courage to try." She gave a nearly shy smile, revealing a softer side of herself. "Surfing, is it?" surprised and intrigued. "Interesting. I didn't know you were into extreme sports." She shrugged, laughing. "I don't know if I am, but I've always thought it would be liberating to try something that challenges me, that takes me out of my comfort zone." Logan nodded, seeing that she truly meant what she was saying. It was unusual for him to see this side of her, a woman who always seemed so focused and methodical. This realization made him reflect on his own life, on how he might have ignored the possibility of living these lighter, more exciting experiences in the name of his achievements and professional success. "And what else is on your list?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Well, there are several things, like taking a spontaneous trip, going to a music festival, learning a new language." Her voice trailed off, and she seemed almost embarrassed to be sharing this with him. But Logan was absorbed in every word, as if he were meeting a new person. He felt a flicker of an old memory, a sensation he couldn't quite place. For a brief moment, a flash of his own childhood came to mind, a time when he too had dreams and lists of things he wanted to do. But he quickly pushed the thought aside. Emily noticed he seemed distant and asked, "Are you all right, Mr. Brooks?" He blinked, refocusing on her. "Yes, of course. Sorry, I was just thinking about nothing important." The discomfort unsettled him, so he decided to change focus. "So you have a list of important things to do before you turn 30, but have you considered that you don't have to leave the company to do them? I could give you more flexibility." She shook her head, a knowing smile on her lips. "I appreciate it, but this is a decision about myself, Logan. I need this time to figure out what I really want in life. It's not about flexibility, it's about purpose." Logan frowned but continued searching for a way to convince her to stay. "I can help with that, if that's truly what you want. I'll give you the support you need to check off these items. Let's make a deal. You help me understand what each of these things means to you, and in exchange we'll try to make it happen together while you stay at Brooks Tech." Emily laughed, finding the offer nearly absurd. But something in his sincerity made her consider it for a moment. "Logan, it's not just about completing a list. It's about the freedom to make choices for myself, without any obligations. I appreciate the offer, but I don't think you understand what that means." He looked at her for a long time, unsettled by her response. But somehow, Emily's resistance and resolve only motivated him to try to understand even more who she really was and what she was searching for. He wasn't used to being opposed, but in this case, he couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to the situation than a simple resignation. Their conversation continued on a lighter note, but Logan knew that the issue remained unresolved. At the end of the night, as the two prepared to leave the restaurant, he looked at her intensely, noticing something different in her gaze, as if she were reliving memories both distant and intimate. He held the door open for her, but before she left, he said, "Emily, I'm going to find out what's really behind that list. And you can be sure that I'm not someone who gives up easily." She smiled, recognizing the challenge in his tone. "Good luck with that, Mr. Brooks," she said, stepping out ahead of him with a lightness that felt almost like a silent dare. As Logan watched her leave, he felt a mix of frustration and fascination. This woman, whom he thought he knew so well, was revealing a new and intriguing side. And for the first time in years, Logan Brooks felt he had encountered a mystery he truly wanted to solve. Logan was more restless than ever. After the dinner where Emily unexpectedly revealed she had a list of things to accomplish before turning 30, he barely managed to sleep. He felt uneasy, intrigued, and to be honest, slightly offended. For years, he had controlled every aspect of his company and much of the routine of those who worked directly with him, especially Emily. The idea that she harbored dreams and plans he'd never heard about left him with a strange sense of dissatisfaction. He wondered why she had never mentioned these aspirations before, and why she suddenly felt such an urgency to pull away from him and the company. However, what unsettled him even more was realizing just how little he knew about the woman who had stood by his side for years. She knew him well enough to predict every response, understand the tone of his voice without needing an explanation, and yet he barely knew what her life outside the office looked like. This realization made him uncomfortable, as if he had overlooked something important by never truly paying attention. The following morning, as soon as he entered his office, Logan called his personal assistant, Nathan, a young and ambitious man who admired Logan deeply and mirrored him in almost every way. Nathan entered promptly, tablet in hand and an ever-alert expression. "Mr. Brooks, how can I help?" Nathan asked, ready for any task. Logan looked at his assistant, hesitating for a moment. He knew the request was somewhat unusual, but his need for answers outweighed any ethical considerations. "Nathan, I need you to do a more thorough investigation into Miss Lawson's personal life." Nathan blinked, surprised, but maintained his professionalism. "Of course, Mr. Brooks. Is there anything specific you'd like to know?" Logan considered the question, keeping his gaze steady. "Anything you can find. I want to know where she lives, if she has close friends, anything that might help me understand why she's so determined to leave the company so abruptly." Nathan hesitated for only a second, surprised by the unusual request. It was rare for Logan to show such interest in someone's personal life, especially a subordinate's, but without questioning, he nodded, determined to execute the task with the efficiency he knew Logan expected. "Understood, sir. I'll have detailed information by the end of the day." Logan nodded, satisfied, though an uneasiness lingered. Watching Nathan leave, he replayed the details of the previous night's dinner in his mind. He recalled Emily's smile as she spoke about her ambitions and dreams, with a sincerity she rarely showed him or anyone at the office. It was almost as if she had been leading a secret life he'd never suspected. The hours dragged on as Logan waited for the information Nathan was gathering. He immersed himself in work, but every time his mind wandered, it returned to the mystery of Emily. When she entered his office briefly to update some figures from the last meeting, he watched her closely, trying to catch a hint of anything in her expression or tone that might offer more clues. But Emily remained calm, her usual professional demeanor intact, seemingly unaware of his turmoil. Around 4 in the afternoon, Nathan re-entered the office, carrying a brown envelope. "Mr. Brooks, I have the information you requested." Logan motioned for him to sit, then took the envelope from Nathan's hands, opening it to reveal a few pages with details about Emily's life he had never known. He scanned the first few lines. Emily lived alone in a modest apartment in a quiet area of the city near a park. She kept to herself, maintained a stable routine, with no significant events or frequent outings. She rarely socialized, and her social media presence was minimal, with only a few scattered photos, mostly of landscapes and books, without anything too personal. Logan frowned as he absorbed the information. Nothing in the report seemed to match the image of the determined, dream-driven woman he'd encountered at dinner. Where were the friends who encouraged her, the outings that inspired her plans? In fact, everything pointed to a solitary, almost reclusive life, as if she kept every important detail hidden within herself. He kept reading, looking for answers that didn't appear, but each line only deepened the mystery. Nathan, noticing Logan's hesitation, ventured a comment. "She seems to be a very private person, sir. Most of her colleagues barely know anything about her personal life. Everything I could find was related to her routine, without much personal insight." Logan nodded slowly. "Yes, I can see that, but people don't just decide to completely change their lives without reason. She must have some motivation, and I want to understand what it is." Nathan remained silent, observing the intensity in his boss's gaze. Logan genuinely seemed troubled, and his concern appeared to go beyond the professional realm, something that surprised Nathan, though he would never express it aloud. Logan reviewed the pages once more before handing the envelope back to Nathan. "Thank you, Nathan. You may go," he said, his tone colder and more distant than usual. He needed time to digest the information, to think about his next steps. After Nathan left, Logan remained lost in thought, disturbed by the fact that, even after gathering information, he still knew so little about what truly motivated Emily. He had always seen her as someone disciplined and predictable, but now he realized he had underestimated her capacity for a private inner life he knew nothing about. As the hours passed and the office emptied, Logan finally decided to leave. He took the elevator down to the parking garage, where he found Emily's car parked near his own. He felt an unexpected urge to wait until she came out, almost as if, by chance, another conversation would arise, giving him a chance to discover more about her. However, he pushed that thought aside, recognizing he was crossing the boundaries of a professional relationship. Back in his penthouse, Logan was again disturbed. It was strange to feel so affected by Emily's impending departure. It wasn't as if he had never lost an employee before, and he had certainly had competent secretaries who came and went, without it impacting his life in the slightest. So what made Emily so different? Why did he care so much? Throughout the night, he woke up multiple times, unable to find answers to the questions that troubled him. That morning, New York City was cloaked in a light mist as Emily arrived at the office and found Logan waiting by the door. Surprised to see him so early, she maintained her composure and gave a slight nod. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks," she greeted him in a neutral tone, accustomed by now to his attempts at probing her thoughts. "Good morning, Emily," he replied with an unusually casual tone that made her raise an eyebrow with suspicion. Logan rarely sounded so relaxed, and she could tell he had something in mind. As they entered the office, he followed her to her desk, an unusual move. He sat in a nearby chair, observing as she prepared his agenda and sorted through documents, his gaze focused on her every movement. After a while, she could no longer ignore the situation. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Brooks?" she asked, attempting to sound casual despite the intensity of his scrutiny. He smiled slightly, a smile she knew well. It was the kind he wore when he was about to propose something he knew she'd likely refuse. "Emily, I need you to accompany me on a business trip to Chicago tomorrow. We have a series of investor meetings, and I need your help to keep everything organized." She hesitated. The idea of a work trip was unexpected, especially given that she was in the process of leaving the company. "Sir, wouldn't it be wiser for me to stay here and complete the arrangements for my departure?" Logan shook his head, his tone firm, as if he'd already anticipated her objection. "No, Emily, I need you there. You know every detail of the presentations we'll be giving, and I see no reason for you not to accompany me." She knew he was being strategic, but she didn't want to let her discomfort show. It would only be a business trip, she reminded herself, professional, direct, with no personal implications. Still, something about the idea of being away from New York with him made her feel uneasy. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she replied, "If it's truly necessary, sir, I'll be ready to leave tomorrow." "Excellent," he responded, his gaze carrying a determination that set her on alert. The next day, they met at the airport early in the morning. Logan, always punctual and impeccably dressed, awaited her with an assessing look. Emily wore a composed expression, more serious than usual, determined to keep her focus on professionalism, reminding herself this was just another work trip. During the flight, Logan worked on his laptop, but occasionally glanced at Emily, observing her as she reviewed notes, adjusted documents, and reorganized the meeting schedule. She was fully absorbed, seemingly oblivious to her surroundings, and Logan couldn't help but notice how much he enjoyed watching her like this, immersed in her work. It was a quality he admired, though he had never openly acknowledged it. When they arrived in Chicago, they went straight to the hotel where they'd be staying. On the way, they exchanged only a few words about the meetings, keeping the conversation strictly professional. The hotel was luxurious, with stunning views of Chicago's skyline. Logan, as always, took charge, arranging for her to have a suite next to his, making it easier to discuss work whenever necessary. After settling in, Logan suggested they dine at the hotel's restaurant to go over the key points for the next day's meetings. Emily agreed, but couldn't shake a sense of nervousness. Being outside the office with him made her more aware of each detail. She reminded herself to maintain professionalism, but something in the way Logan watched her made her uncomfortable, as though he was trying to decipher her. The restaurant's ambience was elegant, with dim lighting and soft music in the background. Logan appeared relaxed, a rare sight which made Emily feel slightly less tense. As they discussed the main points of the presentations, she noticed that he was listening to her with an unusual intensity, as though he was carefully analyzing every word. "Have you been to Chicago before?" he asked, abruptly shifting the topic and catching her off guard. "No, this is my first time," she replied, puzzled by his question. He nodded, seeming pleased with her response. "It's an interesting city. Maybe we can take a walk after tomorrow's meeting if there's time." She smiled politely, aware that this suggestion was out of character for him. Logan wasn't one to suggest casual outings or moments of relaxation. For him, life was always about business and accomplishments. So the idea of a post-work stroll seemed oddly out of place, but she chose not to question it. During dinner, the conversation unexpectedly veered toward more personal topics. Logan, known for his discretion and objectivity, began asking unexpected questions. "Emily, have you thought about what you'd do if you weren't working here?" She looked at him, surprised. "Honestly, I haven't thought much about it. Working at Brooks Tech has always required most of my time." He nodded, a curious glint in his eyes. "I imagine so. You've always been dedicated." He paused, as if gathering the courage to continue. "And do you have any concrete plans for after you leave?" She hesitated, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I'm exploring a few possibilities, but nothing's set in stone yet." Logan was silent for a moment, absorbing her answer. It was clear that her decision affected him in ways he didn't fully understand, and Emily could see a mix of frustration and determination in his gaze. He took a deep breath, seeming to prepare an argument to convince her to stay, but instead, he simply continued the conversation in a casual tone, without pressing further. After dinner, Logan suggested they get some rest since the next morning would be filled with commitments. However, he noticed that something seemed to have shifted between them. The light-hearted conversation and relaxed setting had created a different atmosphere, one that felt more intense than any moment they'd shared at the office. He wondered if Emily sensed this change as well, or if it was only him being affected by the closeness. The following day, the meetings went as planned. Emily was impeccable, anticipating Logan's every need, organizing agendas, and responding to each request with efficiency. Logan, in turn, kept a close eye on her, noticing how much her presence made a difference. At times, as she took notes or helped him prepare for the next presentation, he found himself distracted, analyzing her expressions and the way she moved with a quiet elegance. After their last meeting of the day, Logan looked at her and proposed something that caught her completely off guard. "Let's take a walk. I want to show you the city." Emily hesitated, taken aback by the strangeness of the suggestion, but faced with his insistence, she accepted. They strolled around the area near the hotel, where the streets were illuminated by the glow of storefronts and city lights. The conversation flowed with an unusual ease, and Logan, at times, seemed like a completely different person from the one she knew. He shared stories from his childhood, details about his life he rarely disclosed, like how he'd always loved exploring new cities and had a list of places he wanted to visit one day. Emily was intrigued by this new side of him, a more human, less ruthless side. She listened attentively and at times felt almost moved to realize that beneath Logan Brooks' rigid facade, there was a man with dreams and desires he kept hidden. She felt closer to him in a way that made her nervous yet curious. As they walked, Logan paused by a small plaza and looked at her with a gentle smile. "Emily, remember that list we talked about over dinner? Does any item involve a city like Chicago?" She laughed, surprised by the question. "Not specifically, but I think seeing a new place has always been something I wanted. It's refreshing to be out of the routine." He nodded in understanding. "Sometimes, being outside the usual environment makes us see things differently." They continued walking until, on a sudden impulse, he took out his phone and did a quick search. "There's a famous Ferris wheel nearby. Up for it?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Emily hesitated, laughing nervously. "Logan, that's not on the schedule." He shrugged, as if the schedule didn't matter. Maybe we can break a few rules this time." His response left her taken aback, but she eventually agreed, surprised at how natural the situation felt. They walked to the city's iconic Ferris wheel, where to both of their surprise, they found themselves laughing and talking like old friends, letting down their guards and shedding formalities. During the ride, the tension between them momentarily dissolved, but something deeper began to surface, a feeling that there was far more between them than a simple professional bond. At the top of the Ferris wheel, with the city sparkling around them, Logan looked at Emily in a way he never had before, and she realized that, in that moment, something between them had changed irreversibly. When they returned to New York, Emily barely had time to process everything that had happened on the trip. Life at Brooks Tech was as busy as ever, yet her mind kept drifting back to Chicago, to those unexpected moments alongside Logan. As much as she tried to rationalize it, she couldn't ignore the feeling that had settled between them on the Ferris wheel, when, for a brief moment, everything seemed different. She wanted to believe it was fleeting and that they would resume their usual roles at the office, he, the impassive CEO, and she, the organized secretary, ready to leave. But reality was proving far more complicated. On the first morning back, Emily arrived at the office early, determined to dive back into her routine and avoid being distracted by memories of the trip. She set Logan's coffee on his desk, adjusted the day's agenda, and reviewed every detail of the scheduled meetings, all with her usual precision. However, as the minutes passed, an unsettling feeling grew within her. She realized she was awaiting Logan's arrival with an unusual anticipation, a realization that left her uneasy. It wasn't the first time he'd shown interest in her work, but something had shifted after Chicago. When he finally arrived, the familiarity of his gestures and the intense look he cast her way nearly made Emily lose her composure. Logan crossed the space between the door and her desk with slow, deliberate steps, and when he stopped in front of her, there was an intensity in his gaze that he rarely displayed. He took the day's agenda, but instead of retreating to his office as usual, he paused beside her. "Good morning, Emily," he said with a light, almost informal smile that was a stark contrast to his usual professional tone. She looked at him, controlling her nerves. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks. Everything's set for the 10 o'clock meeting," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady and neutral. "Good," he replied, but instead of moving away, he remained standing there, as though he had something more to say. After a moment's hesitation, he finally continued, a bit unsure. "Emily, I've been considering a few new strategies for our next project, and I'd like to hear your thoughts." The surprise was clear on her face. Although she was always involved in projects, Logan had never asked for her opinion so directly, as though she were more than just an administrative part of the company's machinery. Feeling the weight of the moment, she nodded, keeping her voice calm. "Of course. I can review the details and give you my feedback by the end of the day." He smiled, seeming pleased with her response. "Perfect. Perhaps we can discuss it over lunch." She nodded again, trying to ignore the rising nerves. "I'll be ready." Throughout the morning, Emily focused on her work with greater intensity than ever, trying to push aside the thoughts that insisted on invading her mind. However, Logan's unexpected closeness and the subtle shift in his treatment of her made it hard to maintain her usual objectivity, and she knew the promised lunch would be another opportunity for him to test her resolve, maybe even try to convince her that her place was here, by his side. When lunchtime arrived, Logan met her in the lobby and escorted her to a nearby restaurant, one they had visited with clients on various occasions. But this time, the atmosphere felt different. Instead of keeping the conversation strictly business-focused, he opened up to a more personal dialogue, almost as if he were testing her to understand what she truly thought. "Emily," he began as they waited for their meals, "I see that you're incredibly dedicated and meticulous in everything you do. These years with you by my side have made me trust you completely. But I must admit, I feel like you're distant." She looked up, surprised by his sincerity. "Mr. Brooks, I've been making every effort to maintain the same level of dedication until my last day," she replied, unwilling to admit how much his comment affected her. He watched her, a curious, analytical gleam in his eyes. "It's not about your work, Emily. I know you're more than capable. But something has changed, and I feel that it involves more than just your decision to leave." Emily hesitated, feeling pressured by the intensity of his gaze. She took a deep breath, carefully choosing her words. "I believe we all change over time. And I think I'm at a point where I need something different, sir." He seemed to ponder her answer, his eyes examining her with a depth that made her feel exposed. "Are you sure you can't find that something different here?" She forced a smile, but there was an honesty in her answer she couldn't avoid. "I'm not so sure about that, Mr. Brooks." The rest of lunch passed in a lighter tone, but on several occasions she noticed he kept his gaze fixed on her, as though he were trying to decipher something she herself could barely define. When they returned to the office, Emily felt oddly drained, as though lunch had been an emotional battle that sapped all her energy. In the days that followed, Logan's closeness became increasingly apparent. He involved her in important decisions, sought her opinion in meetings, and consulted her on project details as though ensuring she would always be by his side. For Emily, his attention was both gratifying and unsettling. Each time he drew near, she felt a spark of tension between them, an undeniable sensation that something was changing irreversibly. Despite the inner turmoil, Emily remained firm in her decision. She knew that, as much as she valued her work and Logan's companionship, there was something in her life she still needed to discover, a part of herself that continued to yearn for more. And as difficult as it was, she knew the path to finding that answer wouldn't be at Brooks Tech. One afternoon, as she was reviewing some documents at her desk, Logan approached unexpectedly, holding a folder with an expression that combined seriousness and determination. He placed the folder on her desk and crossed his arms. "Emily, I'm organizing a new division within the company, a project that involves a much higher strategic level than anything you've seen before. And I'd like you to take on a more active role, to stand beside me as my special assistant." The proposal left her completely stunned. Up until that moment, despite knowing how much he valued her work, she'd never imagined he would involve her in such a prominent position, something that required a level of trust and partnership far beyond the usual. "Mr. Brooks, I'm surprised," she admitted, unable to hide her shock. He looked at her, his eyes gleaming as though he knew he'd caught her off guard. "I'm aware it's an unexpected decision, Emily, but I've thought about it a lot, and I believe you're the ideal person for this. And of course, with an appropriate adjustment in salary and benefits, I believe it's an opportunity that could meet your interests." She felt the weight of the offer, and Logan's intense gaze only amplified the feeling that this was a test, a final attempt to keep her by his side. She was tempted, but at the same time, she knew that accepting it would mean giving up her own dreams, the freedom she longed for. "I'm grateful for the confidence, Mr. Brooks," truly, she began, carefully choosing her words. "But even with all this, my decision remains the same." For a moment, he seemed shaken, but his expression quickly hardened. "Emily, I'm offering an opportunity that many would consider the peak of their careers. Are you really willing to leave all this behind without a second thought?" The question struck her, and she took a few seconds to respond. "It's not a matter of not thinking, sir. It's a matter of considering what I truly want for my life." Logan remained silent, his gaze fixed on her. After a moment, he shook his head, as though reluctantly accepting her answer, though it was clear he wasn't satisfied. "Very well, Emily. But know that, until your last day, I'll continue trying to change your mind." She nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. She knew he was sincere, but she also knew she had to be even firmer. After this exchange, Logan became more cautious, maintaining a certain distance, but she felt that the battle between them was far from over. In the weeks that followed, a constant tension marked their interactions. Logan continued to draw her into meetings and decisions, always attentive to her input. Emily, in turn, stayed focused, but each interaction made the line between professional and personal grow increasingly thin. With every look, every conversation, she realized that the bond between them was deepening, even though they both tried to ignore their true feelings. At the end of each day, when everyone else had left and the office was empty, Emily found herself reflecting on all she had experienced at Brooks Tech. That place had been her life for years, and the bond with Logan was something she could never deny. But she knew that her decision was the only way to find the freedom and purpose she so deeply craved. One of those nights, as she was about to leave, she found Logan waiting for her by the entrance. He looked at her with a serious expression, as though he were about to say something important. "Emily, I know I can't force you to do anything, but I want you to know that your presence here has made a difference, and that it will be difficult for me not to have you around." She remained silent, feeling the weight of the impending farewell. His words touched her in a way she hadn't expected, and for the first time, she nearly reconsidered her decision. But instead, she responded with the same honesty she had always maintained. "I know, Logan, and I'll always be grateful for everything I've experienced here." They looked at each other, each harboring a mix of emotions neither was willing to admit. The tension between them lingered, but now they both knew that, whatever the outcome, something between them would always exist, even if it was never expressed in words. The tension that had been building between Logan and Emily over the past few weeks seemed to grow with each passing day, with each encounter in the hallway and each meeting where their glances lingered too long. Emily sensed him drawing closer, yet she had convinced herself that the only way out was to move forward. After all, if she allowed any inappropriate feelings to take root, she would remain trapped there forever. That Friday, Logan requested she come to his office at the end of the workday, when everyone had already left and the building was wrapped in silence. Emily entered, closing the door behind her, and found Logan standing by the window, looking out at the city, lost in thought. He appeared distracted, but as soon as he heard the door, he turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her hesitate. "Emily," he began, his voice calm but tinged with a determination she rarely saw, "I need to understand. I genuinely want to know why you're so set on leaving all this behind. It's not just about work, is it? I feel like there's something more. Something you're not saying." She was taken aback by his sincerity. The way he looked at her, not as someone trying to persuade her to stay, but as someone genuinely seeking to understand, disarmed her. For a moment, she thought of diverting the conversation, of keeping her answers vague and ambiguous, but looking at Logan, she realized it would be pointless. He was resolved to know, and she no longer had the strength to keep up the pretense of indifference. Taking a deep breath, Emily walked over to one of the chairs and sat, keeping her gaze on the floor for a few seconds before looking up at him. "You're right, Logan," she began, her voice slightly hesitant. "It's not just about the job. And honestly, I'm not sure I would have had the courage to say this if you hadn't been so insistent." Logan stayed silent, moving to sit in the chair beside her, his eyes fixed on her, ready to capture each word, each emotion. He didn't interrupt, giving her the space she needed to open up. "I need to leave because I feel like I've been running from certain things in my life," she continued, the words weighing heavily as they left her mouth. "Working here, in such an intense routine, has given me an excuse to ignore unresolved issues, things I've been putting off for years." Her voice faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained control. "Like what?" Logan asked, his voice soft, careful. Emily lowered her gaze again, hesitating before continuing. "My family, specifically my father." She swallowed, feeling the weight of the words. "He passed away a few years before I joined Brooks Tech. At the time, I couldn't handle the loss. So I threw myself into work as a way to escape. Logan remained motionless, absorbing every detail of what she shared. For the first time, he saw that behind the reserved, dedicated professional, there was a woman carrying a pain he'd never imagined. "You never mentioned anything about this," he said, almost in lament. She nodded slowly, her expression somber. "I never thought it was something anyone here would care to know. At first, I thought that if I ignored how I felt, the pain would eventually fade. But over the years, I realized it was eating me up inside. And every time I put off dealing with it, I felt even more disconnected from myself." Logan took a deep breath, processing her words. He had always seen her as strong, tireless, but realizing she too had her own battles made him see her in a different light. "And now, do you think leaving will resolve this?" he asked, but his tone was devoid of judgment. It was genuine curiosity. "I don't know," she admitted, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I have to try. I need to go back home, to the places I grew up, and confront the memories I've been avoiding. I feel that if I don't do it now, I'll never have the courage to." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with emotions they struggled to express. Logan felt a sense of helplessness he rarely experienced. He had always been able to control the people around him, but now, facing Emily and her pain, he realized there were situations beyond his control. "Emily," he finally said, his voice thick, I'm sorry for all of this. I never imagined you were going through something like this." He wanted to say more, but the words felt insufficient against the intensity of the moment. He wanted to reach out, to offer her something, but he wasn't sure what would be appropriate. She smiled slightly, as if she understood what he was trying to convey. "Thank you, Logan. I know it's not easy to understand, but I need this. It's something I owe to myself, and maybe even to my father. I need to find out who I am without hiding in work." He nodded, though deep down he wanted to protest. The idea that she was leaving for something he couldn't fix stirred a frustration within him. For years, he'd been able to solve problems, to offer solutions that kept people in his world under control. But with Emily, he realized the usual rules didn't apply. There was an independence in her that challenged and fascinated him. Unable to resist, he asked, with an almost desperate tone, "And if I could help you somehow? If you had support, something that made it all easier, would you reconsider?" Emily looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, she considered giving in, accepting his help. However, she knew this was a journey she had to undertake alone. "I appreciate it, Logan, truly, but I can't accept that. I need to face this path for myself. I know it may seem irrational to someone as pragmatic as you, but I believe it's the only way to find myself." The silence stretched, and for a moment, neither of them moved. There was a connection between them, something deep and undeniable, that both tried to ignore, but which had become impossible to do in that moment. Logan felt her pain as though it were his own, and it enraged him, knowing he couldn't resolve this situation as he would any problem at work. Finally, he broke the silence. "Whatever you decide, I want you to know you'll always have a place here if you ever want to come back," he said, his voice steady but filled with a sincerity she couldn't ignore. Emily nodded, a faint smile appearing on her lips, grateful for the understanding he showed. "Thank you, Logan, truly, knowing that brings me comfort." The conversation was ending, but the intensity of the moment lingered like an energy in the air. Without realizing it, Logan took a step closer, finding himself nearer to her than he'd ever been. He could feel her breath, and the tension between them became palpable, almost irresistible. For a brief second, he considered crossing that line, letting himself be overtaken by his feelings, but at the last moment, he held back. Emily noticed the closeness, her heart racing. Part of her yearned for it, for the warmth he emanated, but she knew that if she gave in, she would be even more tethered to him and the life she was trying to leave behind. With great effort, she took a small step back, maintaining the distance. "Good night, Logan," she said, her voice soft but firm. He took a deep breath, nodding. "Good night, Emily." She left the room, feeling the weight of what she had revealed, but also a sense of relief for having finally shared part of her story. She knew the coming weeks wouldn't be easy, but she felt more determined than ever to move forward, to confront what she had been avoiding for so long. Logan remained silent, watching her leave, his mind swirling with a storm of thoughts and emotions. He knew that tonight was only the beginning of something larger and possibly irreversible. In the days following that heart-wrenching conversation, something within Logan shifted profoundly. Emily's revelation, the pain in her words, and her unwavering resolve to move forward without him, left him disturbed in ways he couldn't bring himself to admit. He replayed each word, each expression of hers in his mind, trying to grasp why this affected him so deeply. But instead of confronting these feelings, Logan withdrew. He felt exposed and at the same time, powerless, a combination that left him seething. Initially, his reaction was to emotionally isolate himself. He returned to his role as the distant, rigid CEO, a mask he knew how to wear well. He arrived early, went straight into his office without sparing Emily a glance, and barely called her in for meetings. Everything was communicated via brisk, direct emails, as if she were just another faceless employee. When they crossed paths in the hall, he kept his gaze fixed forward, ignoring her presence with a deliberate indifference that bordered on coldness. Emily noticed the change immediately. At first, she thought he might simply be preoccupied with a new project or dealing with company-wide issues. But as the days passed, she realized there was more to it. Logan's coldness was almost tangible, and he seemed to go out of his way to avoid her at every possible moment. It was as though he was trying to erase her presence before she'd even left, which, in a way, hurt more than she'd expected. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her work and on preparing for her departure. Each document she organized, each file she reviewed, served as a reminder that her time at Brooks Tech was coming to an end. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to concentrate, Logan's aloofness left her unsettled. Part of her understood he was merely reacting to what she'd revealed about her father and her reasons for leaving, but that didn't make it any less painful. She'd spent years building a partnership with him, and subtly, she'd grown attached to him. She missed their daily interactions, those brief moments when he unintentionally let his humanity show. As the days dragged on, Logan realized that despite his best efforts, her emotional absence was affecting him deeply. The strategy of maintaining a cold distance, which seemed like a way to protect himself, only intensified the emptiness he felt. Every time she came into his office for a brief, formal update, he was overwhelmed by a mix of anger and sadness. It was as if, by avoiding her, he was trying to evade the pain of her impending departure. Yet her absence from his daily routine was already beginning to feel like a premature loss. One morning, Logan sat in his office, staring at a report he was supposed to be reviewing, but his mind wouldn't cooperate. The words and charts on the screen made no sense, and he kept glancing at the clock as though waiting for something or someone. Then it hit him. He was waiting for Emily. As much as he tried to deny it, the urge to see her, to hear her voice, was undeniable. He needed to confront her, to hear her reasons again, to understand why her presence was so essential to him. But his pride held him back. He'd spent his life building an image of power and control, of someone untouched by emotions, especially in the workplace. Admitting that he was shaken by a personal decision made by his secretary felt like conceding a defeat he was unwilling to face. Yet, the longer he resisted, the more his facade began to crumble. During an important meeting where Emily was present to take notes and organize the agenda, Logan found himself watching her discreetly. She maintained her usual poise, her face serious, her focus unwavering, as always. But there was something different in her expression, a calmness that he found almost unbearable. She was composed while he was caught in an emotional storm. It infuriated him, and his frustration mixed with anger made him even colder during the meeting. When the meeting ended, he left the room without waiting for her, striding straight to his office and closing the door with more force than he intended. He sank into his chair, taking deep breaths, trying to rein in the whirlwind of emotions engulfing him. He felt rejected, yes, but it was more than that. He felt betrayed, as if she was taking something from him, something he hadn't even realized he possessed. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, and for the first time, he felt a twinge of fear. Fear that, in losing Emily, he was about to lose a part of himself he hadn't known existed. That night, as everyone else left the office, Logan stayed behind, deep in thought. The building was empty, the silence absolute, and he felt the weight of his solitude more keenly than ever. Emily's desk, neat and organized, served as a constant reminder that soon she would be gone for good. A sharp ache settled in his chest at the thought of Brooks Tech without her, and for the first time, he considered acknowledging that he felt something beyond professional gratitude. But his pride remained his strongest anchor. If she truly wanted to leave, he would let her go. He wouldn't beg, wouldn't ask her to stay. He had built his success on his ability to control his emotions, to keep a distance that protected him from disappointment. Yet now, alone in his empty office, he saw how fragile that defense was against the looming sense of loss. In a moment of frustration, he picked up the phone and called his assistant, Nathan, instructing him to come to his office. Nathan entered, hesitant, finding Logan with a stern, somewhat unsettled expression. "Mr. Brooks, do you need something?" Nathan asked cautiously. Logan hesitated, looking at his young assistant. He almost wanted to express what he was feeling, but pride held him back. Instead, he asked in a colder tone than usual, "Emily has everything in order for her transition, correct?" Nathan nodded, noticing the tension in Logan's posture. "Yes, sir. She's been working tirelessly to ensure everything is in place before she leaves." The answer, though professional, struck Logan like a blow. Emily was truly resolved to leave, and there was nothing he could do to change that without sacrificing what remained of his pride. He dismissed Nathan with a nod and remained alone, staring into the void of his office. The silence closed in on him, and for the first time, he felt powerless. As the days went on, Logan tried to regain control of his emotions, but each encounter with Emily shook him more. He saw her at her desk, in meetings, organizing files and documents with the same dedication as always, and couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was slipping away. His coldness was a desperate attempt at self-preservation, but at the same time, he felt increasingly hollow and lost. Eventually, he realized that the true issue wasn't her departure, but his fear that, in leaving, she would take with her a part of himself he hadn't known he needed so desperately. In a moment of clarity, alone in his office at the end of yet another empty day, Logan understood that the problem wasn't Emily, it was him. The thought of losing her presence, of no longer having her by his side every day, was more than he could bear. This realization frightened him, but it also made him see that if he wanted any peace, he would have to face these feelings head-on. That morning, Logan was resolute. He had spent a sleepless night wrestling with the emotions that surged whenever he thought of Emily and her imminent departure. The sense of powerlessness and fear of losing her forever had become unbearable, and he knew he had to act. He recognized that he had lost control of the situation, but he decided to turn his vulnerability into a gamble, a chance to convince her to stay, using all the time and resources he had at his disposal. When he entered the office, the atmosphere was quieter than usual, as if an invisible tension hung in the air. Logan walked directly to Emily's desk, where he found her absorbed in her documents. She looked up as she sensed his presence, surprised to see an unexpected determination in his eyes. He seemed more composed, but there was a restless gleam behind his gaze. like someone who had already made an unshakable decision. "Emily," he began, his voice deeper and more intense than usual, "I need to talk to you. It's important." She nodded, sensing the serious tone and slight urgency in his words. She stood and followed him into his office, where he guided her to sit in a chair across from his desk. He closed the door behind them, reinforcing the privacy of the moment, and approached her directly, his expression unreadable. Instead of taking his usual place behind the desk, he sat in the chair across from her, an unusual gesture for Logan. After a brief moment of silence, he took a deep breath and met her gaze. "Emily, I've been thinking a lot about your decision to leave. I know you're firm in your reasons, and I understand how much this means to you. But I've also realized that, for me, it means more than I imagined." She watched him carefully, unsure how to react. Logan was not someone who admitted his emotions easily, and hearing him speak with such sincerity was rare and unexpected. He continued, choosing his words with care, as if each one carried a specific weight. "I understand that you need to resolve personal matters, things I might never fully understand. But even so, I can't just accept your departure without at least trying to convince you to stay. And that's exactly what I intend to do." Emily frowned, confused and intrigued. "Logan, I've explained my reasons. I don't see how that could change in such a short time. My decision is already made." He gave a slight smile, a challenging smile she knew well, though it had never been directed at her in quite this way. "I know, Emily, but I also know that I can change your mind. I'm going to make a proposal, a bet, if you prefer to call it that." She raised an eyebrow, surprised at the direction of the conversation. "A bet? Exactly." 30 days, he said, his eyes fixed on her, exuding unshakable confidence. "I have 30 days to convince you that your life could still be here, with me at Brooks Tech. If I fail, you'll be free to leave and I won't object. But until then, I want you to give me the chance to show you that there may be something here worth staying for." Emily looked at him, the idea seeming both absurd and intriguing. She knew how determined Logan was and how persuasive he could be when he truly wanted something. But on the other hand, she knew he barely understood the depth of her reasons for leaving. Even so, the proposal had a certain appeal, a challenge she couldn't ignore. "So if I understand correctly," she said, a slight smile of disbelief on her lips, "you want me to stay one more month while you try to prove that my decision to leave is wrong?" He nodded, not breaking eye contact. "Exactly, 1 month. And if by the end of that time you still want to leave, I'll accept your decision without further insistence." Emily thought it over, considering the offer. 30 days could pass quickly, and even if he tried every trick in the book, she was confident she could remain steadfast in her decision. "Very well, Mr. Brooks," she finally said, with a faint smile, "I accept your bet. 30 days. Logan allowed himself a smile, one that radiated the confidence of someone who already saw himself as the winner. "Perfect. Let's begin immediately." In the days that followed, Logan seemed like a new person. All the coldness and distance he had once shown had vanished, replaced by an unexpected and even attentive demeanor. He involved her in every important decision, seeking her input for more than just simple opinions and creating opportunities for them to work side by side on more strategic projects. He seemed interested not only in her work but in her ideas and perspectives, as if he were seeing her for the first time as a potential partner and not just a secretary. For Emily, this change in his behavior was strange yet flattering. Logan had never shown such interest in her ideas, had never included her so personally in the decisions he made. And although part of her knew this was all part of the bet, another part felt genuinely moved by his new approach. In the very first week, he invited her to a strategic meeting with Brooks Tech's executives, something that had never happened before. Emily, who typically limited herself to preparing agendas and taking notes, now found herself seated beside Logan, actively participating in the discussions. Logan, at several points, sought her opinion, respecting her input in a way she never expected. Each time he asked for her contribution, she felt a warmth rise to her face, a mix of surprise and admiration that made her question whether he had truly changed, or if this was simply part of the game. After the meeting, Logan invited her to a business dinner at a quiet restaurant, far from the formality of the office. During the meal, he seemed more relaxed, sharing ideas and even asking for suggestions to improve efficiency on certain projects. Emily couldn't deny she was intrigued, as there was a certain vulnerability in his words, something he didn't usually reveal. "Emily," he began, glancing at the menu, "have you ever thought about leading a project? With all your experience, I believe you'd make an excellent manager." The question took her by surprise. She knew Logan valued her work, but she had never imagined he would see her potential for a leadership position. I've never thought much about it, to be honest," she replied, trying to hide her surprise. Logan nodded as if he had anticipated that response. "Maybe you should consider it. I believe you have strategic insight and organizational skills that few possess. And if you stayed, I'd help you develop those skills so you could grow even further." She looked at him, surprised by the offer and by the sincerity in his gaze. She knew Logan could be persuasive, but at the same time, there was a genuine quality to his words that disarmed her. Part of her wanted to believe that he truly saw this potential in her, but another part questioned whether this was merely a part of the bet. Throughout the weeks, Logan continued with his strategy, involving Emily in meetings, sharing ideas, and even challenging her in important decisions, always highlighting her strengths and showing how much he valued her. He took her out for lunches and business dinners, and in those moments, the closeness between them became palpable. There was a silent tension that hung between them, a sense that something was building beyond the professional, though both were reluctant to acknowledge it. As the days passed, Emily felt divided. On one hand, she knew her decision to leave was firm, and her reasons went beyond the work environment. But on the other hand, she couldn't deny that Logan's presence, his interest, and his attention made her question if there was something here worth exploring. He wasn't the cold, distant boss he had once been. Now he seemed human, vulnerable, even kind, and that touched her in a way she wasn't prepared to admit. At the end of the second week, Logan invited her for a walk through the city, a way to unwind after a long workday. They strolled through the park, talking about everything from work to their passions and interests. For the first time, he shared stories of his youth, of the challenges he'd faced to get where he was, and of the sacrifices he'd made along the way. Emily listened intently, touched by the honesty he displayed. It was as if she were finally getting to know the real Logan, the one who had always hidden behind a mask of indifference and power. As the days progressed, Logan continued with the bet, but deep down, they both knew the time was running out. The tension between them grew, and each passing day made Emily feel more drawn to his presence, to the qualities she had discovered and to the vulnerability he now showed her. However, she also reminded herself of the reasons that had driven her to leave in the first place. She knew she needed to address her personal issues, and that, despite Logan's efforts, this decision was one she alone could make. Finally, at the end of the 30 days, Logan asked her for one last conversation. The office was empty, and he awaited her in his office, with an expression that suggested he had accepted the inevitable. When she entered, he looked at her for a long moment, before taking a deep breath and admitting, "I tried, Emily, but I think I understand now that some things are beyond my control." The night of Brooks Tech's annual gala arrived, filling the event hall with a sophisticated elegance that perfectly reflected the company's prestige. The decor was luxurious, with touches of gold and soft lighting that created an intimate, warm atmosphere. Guests, including executives, investors, and employees, mingled in formal attire, chatting and enjoying the evening. Emily arrived later than usual, hoping to remain discreet, but her presence was quickly noticed. She wore a simple, elegant black dress that highlighted her graceful posture, attracting admiring glances as she moved through the crowd. Logan, who had been at the event for some time, noticed her arrival the moment she entered the room. He had been engrossed in conversations with business partners, but couldn't help pausing as he watched her step through the entrance, her polite, reserved smile lighting up the room. He felt an unexpected wave of nervousness, something he, usually composed and unshakable, was not accustomed to feeling. As Emily moved among colleagues, greeting familiar faces, he approached her with a slow, deliberate stride, as though rehearsing each step until he reached her. When she finally noticed him, he was only a few steps away, smiling with a look that conveyed both surprise and a quiet pride. "Emily," he said, his voice low and warm, his gaze traveling from her face to her dress, clearly appreciating her appearance. "You look absolutely stunning tonight." Emily smiled, a bit shyly, unused to such compliments from him. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks. And you also look impressive," she replied, keeping her tone formal, though she could feel the atmosphere was different from what they'd shared before. Logan seemed to notice her hesitation, and with a casual nod, suggested they step away from the crowd. "Please, Emily, just Logan tonight," he said with a gentle smile. "It's a social event, after all." She nodded, feeling slightly more at ease, though part of her still held a certain reserve. Soon, they drifted away from the center of the hall, finding a quieter corner where he could engage in a more personal conversation. So he began, picking up a glass of wine from a nearby tray and offering one to her. "How are you enjoying the evening so far?" Emily took the glass and smiled, visibly surprised by his attention. "It's been pleasant. It's interesting to see the office staff outside of the formal environment. Everyone seems more relaxed." "Yes," he agreed, nodding as he glanced around, as if allowing himself to unwind in the atmosphere. "Events like this are rare for me, too. I usually focus on work, but tonight..." He paused, his gaze returning to her. "Tonight I wanted something different." The intensity of his gaze left her slightly disoriented. She was accustomed to seeing him as the demanding, meticulous boss, but here, under the warm lights of the hall and with laughter and music in the background, Logan seemed like a different person, and she didn't quite know how to handle it. They talked for a few minutes, covering a range of topics, from recent project progress to small personal details they rarely shared. Logan seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her better, and his complete focus was both unsettling and flattering. She had never seen him so open and willing to listen to her stories, and she felt herself gradually relaxing in his company, forgetting the formalities that had always separated them. In a moment of distraction, Emily almost didn't notice that the background music had changed to a slower, more entrancing rhythm. When she finally became aware, she was taken aback by Logan's voice. "Emily, would you honor me with this dance?" he asked, extending his hand with a relaxed smile, his eyes fixed on her in a way that made her hesitate for a moment. She looked at his hand, unsure if it was truly a good idea. The image of the two of them dancing seemed so far removed from the reality they had shared until now that her first instinct was to decline. But seeing the spark in his eyes, she felt something within her yield. "Of course," she replied, almost in a whisper, placing her hand in his. Logan smiled, guiding her to the center of the hall, where other couples were already swaying to the soft music. He gently pulled her closer, and in that moment, Emily realized how close they truly were. His hand on her waist, his touch firm yet delicate, stirred a blend of nervousness and excitement she was trying hard to conceal. As they danced, Logan kept his gaze locked on her, his expression calm, but his eyes held an intensity that made her catch her breath. Emily tried to maintain her composure, but the proximity and his presence were enough to leave her unsettled. She could smell his cologne, feel the firmness of his movements as he expertly guided her, and with each step, Something within her seemed to surrender more and more to the moment. "You know, I'm not used to this," he said in a soft tone, almost as if confessing. "But I have to admit, this is one of the best evenings I've had in a long time." Emily looked at him, surprised by his honesty, and an involuntary smile played on her lips. "I can't deny I'm enjoying it too," she admitted, feeling her heart race at the revelation. For a brief moment, the world around them seemed to disappear, as though they were alone in the hall. Logan watched her with a softened expression, a gleam in his eyes that she had never seen before, and Emily realized suddenly just how sincere he was being. This moment was more than just a dance. It was a silent exchange, a connection that both feared to acknowledge, but that became more undeniable with each step. On impulse, Logan held her hand a bit tighter and whispered, "Emily, if I asked you to stay, would you consider it?" She froze for a second, her heart pounding, unable to respond. The question was direct, unexpected, leaving her speechless. She knew he was serious, yet at the same time, the moment felt almost unreal, as if she were in a dream. She knew, in some way, he was trying to convince her there was something more between them, but her motivations and desires still tugged her in opposite directions. After a brief silence, she composed herself and replied in a low, hesitant voice, "Logan, you know this decision isn't easy for me. There are so many things I need to resolve for myself, things I can't simply ignore." He nodded, but the look in his eyes held an intensity that was almost painful. "I understand, Emily, but I can't help but try. You mean more to me than anything else, and if there's even a chance you might change your mind, then I'll be here, waiting." His response left her completely speechless. She had never imagined he would admit something like that so openly, and it left her feeling more conflicted than ever. She felt as though she were at a crossroads, torn between the desire to leave and the sense that perhaps there was something here, something she had never had the chance to explore. As they continued dancing, Logan kept her hand in his as if trying to savor each second of this unique moment. Emily, in turn, felt increasingly drawn in, yet also more lost, unsure of what she should do. His presence affected her deeply, and at that moment, she felt he might be closer to convincing her than she had anticipated. The music began to slow, signaling the end of the dance, but Logan seemed reluctant to let her go. Emily noticed the hesitation in his eyes, the inner conflict he was trying to conceal, but that was impossible to hide at such a close distance. When the music finally stopped, he leaned slightly closer to her, and for a fleeting moment, their faces were so near that she could feel his breath. It was a brief but intense moment that left them both in silence. Before they could pull away, Logan, his voice low and full of sincerity, said to Emily, "If I have one last chance to convince you, I'll do everything I can to show you that your place is here." She felt a mixture of emotions so intense she could barely respond. She simply nodded slightly, unsure if this was a goodbye or a new beginning. The dance had ended, but the feeling that something new was starting between them was undeniable, leaving them both with a quiet hope and a lingering sense of possibility. The morning after the gala, Emily entered the office feeling as if something fundamental had changed in her life. The dance with Logan, the gentle touch of his hands, and the depth of his gaze lingered in her mind like a vivid memory she couldn't shake. The idea of leaving the company, once so concrete and certain, now seemed uncertain, as if her heart was caught between two worlds, the desire to move on and the ever-growing pull toward the man who, until recently, was simply her boss. Logan, too, was different. Since the previous night, something within him had awakened. He could no longer ignore how much Emily meant to him, and more than that, he was willing to do whatever it took to convince her to stay. That same morning, as he reviewed his schedule and the day's important documents, he recalled the list she'd mentioned in Chicago. There was something about her wish to fulfill certain experiences before turning 30 that resonated with him deeply, and he knew he had to act on it. When he called Emily into his office, Logan was resolute, but his tone was softer than usual. As she walked in, he greeted her with a light smile and an unusual sparkle in his eyes. "Emily, I have something a bit out of the ordinary to propose," he said, watching her carefully. She raised her eyebrows, surprised by the mixture of seriousness and warmth in his tone. "Yes, Mr. Brooks?" He leaned slightly over his desk, crossing his arms and regarding her with curiosity. "Do you remember that list of things you wanted to do before you turned 30? Emily smiled, a bit embarrassed. "Yes, of course. But it's just a personal list of dreams, nothing I ever really expected to share with anyone." Logan shook his head, determined. "Well, I'd like to help you complete those items. This isn't some ploy to change your mind," he quickly added, noticing her cautious expression. "But I think we deserve to enjoy the time we still have together. I want you to have the experiences you've always dreamed of. If it's important to you, it's important to me." Emily was silent, completely taken aback by his proposal. She had never imagined that Logan, the focused and disciplined CEO, would take an interest in her personal dreams, let alone help her achieve them. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, still processing the offer. "There's no need to say anything," he replied with a smile. "Just trust me." In the days that followed, Logan began organizing small surprises, each tailored to help her check off items on her list. One of the first was taking her to a cooking class. One Friday evening after work, he invited her somewhere new, saying only that she should be prepared for a different kind of experience. Emily, still a bit hesitant, agreed and was surprised to arrive at a cozy modern space where instructors were waiting to give them a private lesson. "Surprise," he said with a slight smile, watching her expression as she took it all in. "Logan, I can't believe you arranged all of this just for me," she laughed, visibly touched by his attention to detail. "Of course I did," he replied, grabbing an apron and handing one to her. "I know you like challenges, and tonight we're going to tackle a new one together. This is one of the things on your list, right?" She nodded, enchanted by the idea. They spent the evening laughing and making clumsy attempts at cooking complex dishes. Logan, who had little cooking experience, made small mistakes that had Emily laughing, and she guided him patiently, savoring each moment. The atmosphere was light, and they both felt closer than ever. When they finally finished the recipe, they toasted with a glass of wine, and he looked at her with a mix of tenderness and admiration. "I have to confess, Emily," he said, his voice lowering, "I'm not sure if I'm doing this to convince you to stay or to convince myself I can let you go. The truth is, I've never met anyone like you." Her heart raced at his words, but she managed a soft smile. "Logan, I appreciate every moment, but you know my decision goes beyond what's happening here," she replied, trying to stay clear-headed despite the strong attraction she felt. The following week, Logan continued his mission, taking her to an outdoor music festival. Knowing her love of music, he arranged for them to attend a live concert, another item on her list. They arrived at the event together, surrounded by vibrant lights and an entrancing beat. Logan, somewhat out of his element in the casual atmosphere, couldn't take his eyes off Emily, captivated by her joy and enthusiasm. She danced to the rhythm, smiling with a lightness he rarely saw in her. On impulse, he reached for her hand, and she responded in kind, as though the touch was the connection they'd both been waiting for. As the music played, Logan leaned in to whisper in her ear, "Emily, I've never allowed myself to do things like this. I've never taken moments like this for granted." She looked at him, surprised, seeing something in his gaze that touched her deeply. "Why not?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Because, honestly, I was always afraid," he admitted, his voice low, almost as a confession. "Afraid of getting attached, afraid of losing control. You, Emily, you make me feel things I never thought I would." Emily felt her chest tighten, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. She felt the same way, but the reasons for her departure were still so deeply ingrained in her mind that she hesitated. She knew that by opening herself up to him, she risked getting more involved than she'd planned. However, his vulnerability, the sincerity in his words, made her realize that Logan, too, carried his own fears and insecurities. When the concert ended, they walked together to the car in a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken emotions. They both knew that, despite the precious memories they were creating, the farewell was drawing nearer, casting a quiet sadness over each encounter. One of the last items on Emily's list was visiting the ocean, and on a Saturday afternoon, Logan surprised her once more, this time with a trip to the beach. They arrived at sunset, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, reflected in the calm waters. Emily kicked off her shoes and ran to the water's edge, feeling the cool sand under her feet as Logan watched from a distance, captivated by the joy in her expression. As he joined her, Emily looked at him, and for a moment, the beauty of the scenery and the intensity of the moment made her forget all her doubts and fears. "Thank you for all of this, Logan. You've truly made these moments unforgettable." He smiled, but there was a hint of melancholy in his eyes. "I'd do it all over again if it meant you would stay." She fell silent, feeling the weight of his words, and without thinking, reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. Logan, surprised by the gesture, held her hand firmly, and for a moment, they stood there, gazing out at the ocean together. Emily knew she had grown closer to him than she had ever imagined, and now, standing on the brink of a decision, she felt torn between what her heart wanted and what her mind kept reminding her. Logan turned to her, his face full of determination, and said, "Emily, I need you to know one thing. I'm not giving up. Even if you leave, I'll be here, waiting. Because somehow, you've become essential to me, and I don't think I've ever told anyone that." Emily felt her heart ache, his words resonating deeply within her. She wanted so badly to reciprocate, to tell him how much he meant to her, but she was still held back by the decision she'd made. She knew Logan was willing to fight for her to stay, but she also knew there was something within herself she needed to discover, something she could only find by moving forward. But in that moment, as the sun set and the ocean breeze surrounded them both, Emily allowed herself to live in the present without worrying about tomorrow. She rested her head on Logan's shoulder, feeling the warmth and comfort of his presence, and remained silent, her heart full of feelings she could not express. The connection between Emily and Logan grew deeper with each passing day. Their moments outside the office, the unexpected conversations, and the shared understanding had transformed their relationship in ways neither could ignore. Emily knew that Logan was gradually revealing himself, but she sensed there was something he kept hidden, a pain he carried in silence that intrigued her more than he might realize. One morning, while organizing some documents, Emily came across an old file from a project Logan had led years before she joined Brooks Tech. The report was dense and detailed, but what caught her attention was a handwritten note scrawled in the margin. "Nothing remains untouched forever." The phrase lingered in her mind, stirring a curiosity she couldn't shake. When she found the chance, she brought up the project with Logan, but she noticed his discomfort when she mentioned the note. His gaze flickered away for a second before he quickly composed himself, as though donning an armor to guard against unwelcome emotions. "That was a long time ago, Emily," he replied, attempting to dismiss the subject with a slight smile. "I suppose I was more sentimental back then." But Emily sensed there was more beneath his words, that he was hiding something behind that enigmatic smile. Even without pressing him, she could tell that the phrase carried a piece of his past, something he wasn't yet ready to share. Over time, it became clear that Logan kept certain parts of his life hidden, perhaps even from himself. The opportunity to learn more arose a few days later when Logan invited her to join him at a charity dinner for an organization supporting children in need. The event was formal, and he mentioned that her presence would not only ease introductions, but also lighten the evening. Emily accepted the invitation, but throughout the dinner, she noticed Logan was more reserved than usual. As toasts were made and the room buzzed with energy and celebration, Logan kept his distance, his expression somewhat distant. When they stepped away from the crowd to a quieter corner, Emily finally decided to approach the subject, intrigued by the faraway look on his face. "Logan, you seem different tonight," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Do these events usually affect you like this?" He looked at her, clearly surprised by her question, and hesitated before responding, as if deciding between keeping up his guard or opening up. After a moment, he sighed, his expression softening. "It's not exactly the event, it's more what it represents." Emily waited in silence, giving him the space he needed to continue if he wished. Logan looked away, focusing on a distant point in the room before finally turning back to her, his voice low and measured, but with a vulnerability she'd never heard before. "I've never shared this with anyone at the company, but my childhood wasn't exactly typical." She watched him intently, aware of the internal battle in each word he chose. Logan rarely let his emotions show, but at that moment, she knew he was on the verge of revealing something profound, something he'd kept hidden for years. "I grew up in a neighborhood that wasn't very safe," he began, his eyes locked on hers, but with a melancholic gleam. "My mom was the one who held everything together. My father, he left when I was young, and she never had much support. I remember her working all day, coming home exhausted and still making sure I was taken care of, that I had everything I needed." He paused, swallowing hard, as though each memory weighed heavily as he spoke. Emily felt her chest tighten. She had never imagined that Logan, the unshakable CEO, had endured such hardships. "That must have been incredibly hard for both you and your mother," she said softly, not wanting to interrupt but offering the support he might need to continue. He nodded with a sad smile. "She was everything to me. She always said that one day I could achieve something greater, that our circumstances didn't define us. I promised her I'd do everything I could to get out of there, and I did. But when I was 15, she got sick." Logan's voice broke slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "She fought for a while but eventually passed away." Emily couldn't help reaching out and touching his shoulder, sensing the deep pain in his words. Logan took a deep breath, looking at her hand on his shoulder, as if finding comfort in that simple touch. "After that, I was alone. I didn't have any close family, and those around me saw me as more of a problem than someone with potential. But even without her, I clung to that promise, studied as hard as I could, took on temporary jobs, saved every penny. That's how, years later, I managed to get a scholarship to study business. But since then, I've never gone back to that place." "I understand why this organization means so much to you," Emily said, her voice filled with empathy. "It's almost as if, in a way, it's a tribute to what your mother did for you, isn't it?" He nodded, a slight smile on his lips. "Yes, I get involved in these events, support their campaigns, but I've never shared this story with anyone. I guess part of me always thought that keeping it to myself would help me maintain a strong, secure image. But lately, I've realized that I don't need to hide everything to be strong." Emily smiled, touched by his vulnerability. "Logan, you are strong, and that has nothing to do with what you show or hide. People respect you not only because of your competence, but because, somehow, you care. You might not realize it, but your example inspires others." Logan looked at her, taken aback by her words. Emily's gaze, sincere and warm, pierced through every wall he had built over the years. For the first time, he felt someone truly understood him, understood the pain and choices that had shaped his life. "Thank you, Emily," he whispered, his eyes glistening slightly, as if her words were exactly what he needed to hear, but never knew how to ask for. "I think that deep down, that's what I feared, that by admitting this part of my past, I'd somehow lose others' respect. But with you, I don't feel that fear." Emily held his hand firmly, without looking away. "Logan, you won't lose people's respect by being honest about who you are. If anything, it only makes you stronger. We all have our stories, and when we open up, we show our humanity." For a moment, they stayed silent, simply feeling the closeness between them, a connection that went beyond words or gestures. They stood in a secluded corner of the room, where the music and conversations felt like a distant backdrop, underscoring the intensity of the moment. Logan felt the warmth of her hand in his, and Emily's serene expression brought him a peace he hadn't felt since his youth. He took a deep breath, as if allowing himself to fully relax for the first time. "Emily, I've spent my whole life trying to prove something, as if each achievement was a way to honor her memory. But now I realize that's not enough. I need something more, something real that makes me feel whole. And somehow, when I'm with you, that search makes sense." Emily was speechless, but the emotion on her face was unmistakable. She understood the weight of his declaration and felt something shift within her as well. More than ever, she realized that she had found in Logan someone who understood her pain, who bore the same invisible scars. In that instant, she knew he was more than the respected boss she'd always admired. He was someone she cared for deeply, someone who, in his own way, was seeking his own peace. When the night ended, they left the event together, in silence but with a mutual understanding that didn't need words. Their walk to the car was quiet, both of them savoring the tranquility of the night and each other's presence. Logan, on impulse, held her hand once again, as though the silent gesture could express everything he had yet to say. "Emily," he began, stopping for a moment to look at her with intensity. "I don't know where this will lead us, but I want you to know that I'm here, and whatever you decide, you will always have a place beside me." Emily smiled, feeling a blend of happiness and sadness, because she knew the connection between them was real, but also knew of the doubts and fears that still lingered in her heart. "Logan, thank you for everything. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that you too will always have a special place in my life." They said goodbye with a long embrace, both aware that although the final decision remained uncertain, something between them was undeniable, something that could never be forgotten. After that night of revelations, Emily felt closer to Logan than ever, but also more divided. Each time she remembered the vulnerability he'd shown, the warm touch of his hands, and the sincere words he had whispered, a part of her wanted to give in, to abandon her plans and simply stay by his side. But something inside kept pulling her away, insisting that, for Logan, she might always be nothing more than his secretary. And no matter how much he said otherwise, that doubt gnawed at her. In the days that followed, Emily returned to her office routine, yet everything felt different. Logan included her in nearly every aspect of his professional life, frequently inviting her to meet after hours. He wanted to discuss ideas and talk about the future of the company, as if she were an important partner rather than just an assistant. But beneath each invitation, every lingering glance or gentle touch, she felt the intensity of his feelings, and it left her confused. To her, it was impossible to know if he genuinely saw her as a woman with her own desires and ambitions, or if their closeness was merely a desperate attempt to keep her close. One particularly long evening, after a meeting with investors, Logan invited her to dinner at an intimate restaurant. It was a quiet place with soft lighting and spaced-out tables that provided privacy. He suggested dinner as a celebration of the meeting's success, and though hesitant, Emily accepted. Each time they were together outside of work, she felt a mix of excitement and apprehension, knowing these encounters only intensified the attraction between them. As they talked, Logan opened up even more, sharing the challenges he had faced in building Brooks Tech and how, over time, work had become the center of his life, almost a refuge. "In the end, Emily," he said softly, "you're one of the few people who's really understood me. It's rare to find someone I can share so much with." Emily nodded, understanding what he meant, yet her insecurity lingered. She felt honored that he considered her so important, but she couldn't shake the feeling that in his eyes, she'd always be limited by the role she played at the company. Even with all the special moments, with all the intimacy they had shared, she feared he only saw her as a reliable fixture in his professional life, someone he trusted to support him, but not a whole person with dreams and goals of her own. During dinner, he gazed at her with undeniable intensity, and at one point, he reached for her hand across the table, stroking it gently. Emily's heart raced, her thoughts a blur. She wanted so much to believe that his feelings were real, that he saw her as something beyond a dedicated assistant, but the doubt remained. "Emily," he said, his voice low and full of emotion, "I don't know what the future holds for us, but I know that what I feel for you is much more than simple admiration. I don't think I've ever felt as close to anyone as I do to you." His words left her even more conflicted. Logan was a powerful man, accustomed to controlling everything around him, and hearing this vulnerability in his voice moved her deeply. But the fear that, in the end, he would see her only as a shadow in his life kept her from fully giving in. She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Logan, I appreciate everything you've done, but I'm afraid that what you see in me is limited by my role in your life. I want to be more than a dedicated secretary. I need to be a person with my own dreams, my own goals." He looked at her, surprised, as if he hadn't considered she might feel this way. "Emily, I never wanted to reduce you to that. I know you're much more than any title. You're intelligent, talented, and full of ambition. I admire that about you, but do you really understand?" She countered, feeling the weight of each word. "My fear is that, in the end, I'll end up trapped in this role that you'll see me only as someone there to support you, and not as a person with a life of her own. I don't want to be an extension of your world. I want to live in my own world too." Logan fell silent, clearly shaken by her words. He knew, in a way, that she was right. For so long, he'd relied on her efficiency and dedication, and the thought of losing her terrified him. But at the same time, he realized that his fear of letting her go might be limiting her ability to see how much she truly meant to him. He wanted her by his side, but he knew he had to find a way to show her that he respected her autonomy and valued her beyond the role of secretary. "Emily," he said finally, his tone sincere, "I understand your concerns. And maybe it took me too long to realize just how much you mean to me beyond work. But know that I want you to be happy, even if it means following a different path than mine." She looked at him, surprised by his honest response and the tone of acceptance he showed. Rather than pressuring her to stay, as he had done before, Logan seemed ready to let her go if that was best for her. This touched something deep within Emily because, for the first time, she felt he genuinely saw her as an independent person, someone with a life and dreams of her own. The evening ended in a comfortable silence, full of emotion. When he walked her to her car, both of them knew that something had shifted. Logan didn't push further, and Emily, though still conflicted, felt that he was prepared to respect her decision. But at the same time, this new attitude only made her feel the attraction to him even more. The tension between them, the looks, the gentle touches all seemed to intensify as time went on. By the end of the week, Emily tried to stay focused on work, but doubt consumed her. She was growing more and more involved, increasingly tempted to set her fears aside and simply give in. But the fear that Logan didn't see her beyond her role as a secretary still haunted her. Each time she thought of surrendering, she imagined herself trapped once more in a secondary role, without autonomy, without the chance to pursue her own dreams. In a moment of anguish, she decided to confront Logan once again. At the end of the workday, she knocked on his office door, determined to clarify the doubts consuming her. Logan, who was reviewing documents, looked up, visibly surprised by the intensity in her gaze. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice firm but full of emotion. He nodded, motioning for her to come closer. "Of course, Emily. What's going on?" She took a deep breath, her heart racing, but she knew she had to be honest. "I need to know, Logan. I need to understand if you really see me as someone with a life of my own, with ambitions. I'm afraid of getting stuck in this role of secretary forever." Logan looked at her in silence, taking in every word, and saw the seriousness in her eyes. Finally, he stood up and walked over to her, stopping just a few steps away. "Emily, I don't know how else to say this, but you mean so much more to me than that. I see you as a complete woman, with strength, intelligence, and dreams of your own. And I want you to know that, no matter what you choose, I will always support you." His words struck her with unexpected force. She knew Logan was being sincere, that he was willing to let her pursue her own path, yet the fear remained. Something inside her prevented her from fully trusting, as if the wounds of the past and the insecurities of the present combined to create a barrier that even the deepest feelings couldn't break down. Logan watched her, seeing the conflict in her eyes, and impulsively took her hands in his. "Emily, I know you're more than any job title. You're an incredible woman, and even if you choose a different path, I'll respect that. But if, at any point, you realize your place is here, I'll always be waiting with open arms." Her heart raced, his words echoing in her mind, yet her indecision still consumed her. She knew she loved what they shared, but she also knew that, to truly find herself, she would need to face her own fears and perhaps follow a different path for a while. That night in the office was quieter than usual. Most of the employees had already left, and Emily stayed behind, organizing some documents on Logan's desk. The tension of recent days left her restless, and the confusion of emotions was so intense that she found it hard to focus on anything. Every word, every gesture from him made her heart race, but insecurities and the fear of being nothing more than support in his life held her back. Then Logan entered the room, closing the door behind him. He looked tired, as if he too was fighting an internal battle, but his eyes were fixed on her with unmistakable intensity. For a moment, he simply observed her in silence, as if trying to absorb every detail of the scene, each line in her expression. Emily, feeling the weight of his gaze, hesitated, but forced herself to hold eye contact, though her heart was pounding and her hands trembled slightly. "Emily," he said finally, his voice low and thick with an emotion she couldn't fully decipher, "we need to talk." She nodded, waiting for him to continue, but Logan seemed to be searching for the right words, as though there was something he was afraid to say. She felt torn between wanting to understand what he was feeling and the fear that, in knowing, she might finally surrender to the forbidden pull between them. "I can't keep pretending I can ignore what I feel," he said, taking a step toward her, his voice softer now, like a confession he'd held onto for far too long. "You mean so much more to me than any role, any title. Emily, you're the person I feel closest to, and the only person who makes me want to be better." His words hit her hard, and for a moment, Emily couldn't respond. Her heart pounded fiercely, and she felt the walls she had built over time begin to crumble. She knew there was something between them, but hearing Logan admit his feelings so vulnerably, so honestly, left her reeling. "Logan," she began, but her voice faltered. I feel something powerful too. But I'm afraid that if I give in, I'll lose myself, that everything I am will come second." He looked at her tenderly, taking another step closer. Now they were so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him, his breath soft and steady with each word. "I understand, Emily. I know you have dreams, and I want you to fulfill them. I don't want you to lose yourself. I want you to be exactly who you are." His words, so sincere and heartfelt, broke through Emily's last defenses. Her eyes welled up without her realizing it, and before she could stop herself, a tear rolled down her cheek. Logan, seeing this, gently reached out to wipe it away, his touch tender and unexpected. She closed her eyes briefly, letting herself feel the moment. When she opened her eyes, Logan was still there, so close she could see every detail of his face. The desire and vulnerability he showed were undeniable, and without another word, he leaned in slowly until his lips were just a breath away from hers. Emily's heart pounded wildly, and for a fleeting second, all that held her back melted away. Then, as if time itself had stopped, Logan's lips met hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative at first, but quickly grew deeper, as though they had both been waiting for this forever. She felt his hands slide to her waist, pulling her closer, and her own hands found their way to his shoulders, holding him as if he might vanish. The sensation was overwhelming, and every second of the kiss seemed to deepen the bond between them. The world around them faded. All that remained was the warmth of his lips, the firm grip of his hands, and the intensity of the moment they shared. Emily felt utterly immersed, as though she was finally where she was meant to be. It was forbidden, but it felt so right, and each instant only made her want more. But suddenly, as if a wave of reality had hit them both, they broke apart, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. Logan looked at her, still catching his breath, with a mixture of surprise and regret, as though he were coming to grips with what he had just done. Emily, her hands still on his shoulders, tried to calm her racing heart and the chaos of emotions swirling within her. I'm sorry, Emily, he stammered, his voice uncertain, as though fighting against the desire to continue. I shouldn't have done that. She shook her head, attempting to regain her composure. No, you don't need to apologize, Logan, she murmured, though her heart was conflicted. But maybe this just makes things harder. He nodded, clearly troubled. I know, it's everything I didn't want to do, but I couldn't stop myself. You mean so much to me that I think I forgot how to handle it. Emily felt a pang in her chest at his words. The intensity of the kiss still lingered, and the urge to give in to her feelings for Logan was almost irresistible. But she knew that if she went down this path, everything she had planned, everything she wanted to build for herself, would be at risk. She feared that by getting fully involved with him, her own identity would become tied to the role of companion and supporter, pushing aside her own ambitions. They stood there in silence, trying to process the torrent of emotions swirling around them. The attraction between them was undeniable, but the fear and doubts were just as powerful. Logan knew that the kiss solved nothing. If anything, it had made everything more complicated. Yet part of him couldn't regret it. It was clear that his feelings for Emily ran deeper than he could explain. And now, after that intimate moment, it was even harder to imagine letting her go. In the days that followed, they both tried to return to their usual routines, but the impact of the kiss was undeniable. Each encounter in the hallway, every exchanged glance, brought back the memory of that shared moment with full force, and they both struggled to keep their composure. Logan tried to maintain his professional demeanor, but the more he tried to keep his distance, the more he felt drawn to Emily in a way that defied control. Her presence in the office was a constant reminder of what they could have, and he knew he was losing the ability to pretend nothing had changed. For Emily, the situation was equally complicated. Logic told her to keep her distance, that this relationship would place her in a position of dependence she had always feared. But her heart betrayed her, reminding her of the warmth of Logan's touch, the intensity of the kiss, the undeniable connection they shared. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't erase his memory, and with each passing day, it became more challenging to resist the desire to be with him. The situation intensified one evening after hours. Emily was in the office, reviewing the final details of her report, when Logan entered, visibly tense. Without a word, he walked over to her, stopping only a few steps away. His eyes conveyed a mix of determination and vulnerability, and for a moment, Emily felt time stand still again. "Emily," he began, his voice low and controlled. "I tried. I tried to keep my distance, to respect your choices, but I can't. Every time I look at you, every time I think about what we're trying to ignore, I feel like I'm fooling myself." She looked at him, her heart racing, but kept her calm. "Logan, I feel the same. But what I'm most afraid of is losing myself. I want you to see me as a woman with dreams, with her own goals, not as an extension of your life." Logan nodded, understanding the depth of her fear. "And I do see that, Emily. Maybe it took me too long to realize it, but I know who you are. And I know that whatever decision you make, it will be for you. But that doesn't change what I feel, what I want." They stood in silence for a moment, but the desire between them was uncontrollable, and the connection undeniable. Logan took another step forward, closing the space between them, and Emily felt his intense gaze penetrate her last defenses. She knew she could step away, but the desire held her there, and unable to resist, she took a step toward him. Logan's eyes shone with a mixture of emotions, and when their lips met again, it was as if all doubts and fears vanished. The kiss was intense, laden with all the emotions they had held back, and they both surrendered to the moment, fully aware that they were crossing a line, yet unable to stop. The next morning, as the sun barely lit the New York skyline, Emily woke up to a notification on her phone. It was an email from a prominent consulting firm in Boston, offering her a leadership role in a new project. She read the message several times, feeling a mix of surprise and excitement. The email highlighted her potential, recognized her exceptional work history, and mentioned the freedom to build her own team, a clear sign that they saw her as much more than a support role. For a few minutes, she sat on the edge of her bed, absorbing the news. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she had always dreamed of, a job that not only valued her as a professional, but would also allow her to be independent, to build something of her own and shape her path. She thought of Brooks Tech, of all the years she had dedicated to the company, and inevitably of Logan. He had become such a significant part of her life and thoughts that the idea of leaving felt like it took him out of her heart for a few moments, but not enough. Logan was the man who made her heart race like no one ever had. But the offered job was the first concrete sign that she could live her own dreams. After reflecting, she decided she would move forward with the new job. She felt sad, almost anguished at the thought of saying goodbye to Logan, but she knew it was a necessary step. She was determined to build her own identity, even if it meant letting go of the relationship that had made her question every plan. The decision was made. Emily accepted the offer, and for the first time in months, she felt light, though with the heavy weight of farewell. At the office, Emily continued her work with the same dedication, but inside, she was already somewhere else. Quietly, she began preparing her departure, organizing folders, transferring responsibilities, and making sure everything would be in order. She focused intently, but every small gesture of goodbye felt like a weight, even though she was still far from announcing her departure to her colleagues, and especially to Logan. But Logan, even without knowing her decision, started noticing subtle changes in her behavior. Emily was more distant, her glances with him were briefer and more restrained, and her gestures seemed hurried in a way he didn't understand. Logan felt a growing unease. He observed her discreetly, noticing every detail with the precision only someone deeply connected could have. Each fleeting smile, each quick encounter, it all seemed to signal something he didn't want to admit. Maybe she was really leaving. One afternoon, while organizing documents in his office, he called her in. The tone of his voice was enough to tell her he knew something was wrong. She walked into his office and closed the door behind her, trying to keep her composure. But Logan couldn't hold back. He watched her closely, as if trying to decipher what lay behind her sudden distance. "Emily," he began, crossing his arms with a serious look, but with unmistakable anxiety in his eyes. "Is there something you're not telling me?" She hesitated, fighting the urge to pull back, but she knew she couldn't hide the truth much longer. She took a deep breath, meeting his gaze, as she gathered the courage to admit what was happening. "Yes, Logan, I received a job offer in Boston. It's an incredible opportunity, and I accepted it." Her words seemed to echo in the room, creating a heavy silence. Logan stood still, his eyes fixed on her, but his expression betrayed a whirlwind of emotions: shock, pain, and above all, fear. He didn't respond immediately, as if the news had left him speechless. You're leaving?" he asked finally, his voice rough, almost a whisper. Emily nodded, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Yes, Logan. I feel it's time to move forward, to find my own path, as I've always wanted. This opportunity is everything I've been waiting for. I need this." Logan looked away for a moment, as if trying to process the situation, but it was clear he was shaken. The thought of losing her had always been a distant possibility, something he had fought to ignore, but now, with reality staring them in the face, he couldn't hide the panic rising in his chest. "So, that's it." He looked back at her, his gaze full of pain. "You're really going to leave everything? Leave us behind?" His words struck her like a blow. Emily felt Logan's vulnerability, and the intensity of his feelings was something she never imagined seeing. But at the same time, she knew she had to stay true to her own needs. This wasn't just about him. It was about her and her future. "Logan, this isn't easy for me," she said, her voice trembling. "You mean so much to me, but I need to do this for myself. I've always wanted to feel complete, to have a purpose beyond supporting someone else." Logan took a deep breath, trying to control the anguish he felt. He stepped closer to her, his expression softening slightly, but the desperation remained in his eyes. "Emily, I know I've been selfish. Maybe I never showed you how much you mean to me, but now that you're leaving, all I feel is fear. Fear of not having you by my side. I need you, Emily. I need you more than I ever realized." She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back tears that threatened to fall. His words were almost unbearable, but Emily knew that if she gave in, she would end up sacrificing something fundamental within herself. This was her dream, the chance to finally be who she had always wanted to be. With her heart aching, she replied, "Logan, I need to be myself too. I can't be complete without taking this step." He nodded slowly, as if finally understanding the depth of what she was trying to say. "I understand, Emily," he said, his voice low and filled with a sadness she had never heard before. "But know that, without you, none of this Brooks Tech my work. None of it has the same meaning." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. They stood there, face to face, each grappling with their own fears and conflicting desires. Logan wanted her to stay, but he knew it would be selfish. Emily needed to leave, but the love she felt for him kept pulling her back. The pain was palpable, and each passing second seemed to prolong the suffering they both felt. The following days were even more difficult. Now fully aware of Emily's irrevocable decision, Logan oscillated between acceptance and despair. Each time he saw her working, preparing for her departure, he felt panic growing. He tried to act as usual, but his movements betrayed the tension consuming him. He could no longer ignore the idea that soon, the office would feel empty without her presence. Every glance, every small smile from Emily became a constant reminder of what he was about to lose. For Emily, preparing to leave was a painful process. Each file she archived, each responsibility she passed on to a colleague, weighed heavily with the thought of the impending farewell. The thought of leaving everything she had built at Brooks Tech, and above all, leaving Logan, was a constant ache, but she knew she had to move on. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for, and if she didn't take it, she knew she would regret it. The tension between them became unbearable. During a farewell meeting with some colleagues, Logan barely managed to hide his sadness, and Emily felt his gaze on her the entire time, as if he were imprinting every detail of her presence into his memory. When the meeting ended and everyone had left the room, Logan remained silent beside her, looking out the window at the city skyline. "I wanted it to be different," he finally said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "I wanted to be someone you could rely on without fear, someone who let you be who you are without needing to leave." Emily stepped closer, gently touching his arm. "You are someone I rely on, Logan, and you always will be." Her words were soft, but her sincerity was unmistakable. He looked at her, his face etched with restrained desperation, and Emily could see the depth of the feelings he was struggling to hide. And before he could stop himself, he pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly, as if this act alone could prevent her from leaving. She nestled into his arms, feeling the warmth, the security, and the love pouring from his touch. But even there, in an embrace full of meaning, she knew her future lay somewhere else. That night, after a silent goodbye shared through an embrace that held more words than either of them could ever say, Emily returned home exhausted, bearing the weight of an impending farewell. Though she tried to maintain her resolve, Logan's face holding that mix of acceptance and pain lingered in her mind, tormenting her with a relentless doubt. She felt torn between the need to follow her own path and the love that had inevitably deepened with each passing day. The bright future she had always dreamed of was within reach, yet the emptiness that came with leaving him brought an unexpected ache. Logan, for his part, stayed up all night. Sitting on the sofa in his expansive but lonely penthouse, with the city lights shimmering in the distance, he held a glass of wine but barely tasted it. He thought about everything that had happened between him and Emily, every detail, every conversation, every gentle touch she had brought into his life with a delicacy and strength he had never experienced with anyone else. And now she was leaving. The reality of losing Emily devastated him, but deep down, he knew he couldn't force her to stay. His own selfish desires had brought them to this point, and he was paying the price. The next day, the atmosphere in the office felt heavier than ever. The days passed too quickly, and Emily knew her departure was drawing near. Logan avoided her, appearing as little as possible within her line of sight, but the anguish he felt was almost tangible. When they did meet in meetings or brief work conversations, the exchanged glances revealed all that they both tried to hide. He wanted to beg her to stay, but he knew that doing so would only add to the burden on her shoulders. Emily also knew that she was leaving with a broken heart, but she tried to convince herself it was the right thing to do. On a rainy afternoon, Logan couldn't hold back any longer. After a meeting, he asked her to stay a bit longer. As the rest of the team left, they were left alone, with the sound of rain against the large glass windows and the tension between them filling the silence. Logan took a deep breath, as if he needed to gather the strength for what he was about to say. "Emily," he began, trying to keep his voice steady, though she could hear the weight in every word. "I know you're determined to go, and I know part of that is my fault." He paused, looking down at his hands, visibly uncomfortable. "If I had been more honest about my feelings from the start, maybe you would have felt differently about us." Emily felt a pang in her chest but held herself together. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but hearing those words directly from Logan left her breathless. He continued, finally meeting her gaze with an unbreakable intensity. "I tried, Emily. I tried to show you that I see you as so much more than a secretary, but I feel like I failed. And now I'm about to lose the only person who truly matters." She remained silent, feeling tears gather, though she refused to let them fall. The conflicting emotions were overwhelming. She wanted to tell him that she loved him, that he was special, but she also knew that she had to stay firm in her decision, or risk losing herself in the relationship and abandoning everything she had always dreamed of. "Logan," she finally replied, her voice wavering slightly, "I feel the same way. But I need to move on. I need space to find out who I am without depending on anyone. I don't want to live in someone else's shadow, even if that someone is you." Logan nodded, accepting her words with difficulty, but understanding there was nothing more he could do. The silence between them was heavy with shared pain, a pain they both knew was unavoidable. Yet, before she could pull away, Logan stepped closer, gently holding her hands. "If that's what you want," he said, lowering his gaze to their intertwined hands, "then I won't stop you. But I want you to know one thing. I'll wait for you, Emily. No matter how long it takes, I'll be here, ready to welcome you back if one day you decide that this is your place too." His words struck her like a blow. She felt the depth of Logan's feelings, but she didn't know what the future would bring or if she could ever return to him. At the same time, his words were a relief, as if they left open the possibility of a future, one day. After that conversation, Emily spent her final days at Brooks Tech with the certainty that she was making the right choice, though the weight of goodbye never lessened. On her last day, her colleagues organized a small farewell, and the sense of nostalgia crept in before she even left. When the gathering ended, Logan asked to meet her one last time in his office, both of them aware that this would be the final goodbye. He was waiting by the window, looking out over the city, but turned as she entered. Emily watched him, feeling that this moment held more significance than either of them was willing to admit. She approached him, and Logan gave her a sad but sincere smile. "I hope you find everything you're looking for," he said, his voice filled with tenderness and an understanding that deeply moved her. "Thank you, Logan," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget what we had or everything you did for me." He extended his hand, and without hesitation, she took it. They stood there for a moment, in silence, as the world around them seemed to fade away. He leaned in, and she felt his breath close to her face, but instead of a parting kiss, he simply rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes as if absorbing that moment to keep it forever. "Take care, Emily," he whispered, and she knew those words carried a love and a sorrow that would transcend time. With tears in her eyes, she left him behind, knowing this was the end of a chapter she would never forget. On the morning of Emily's last day at Brooks Tech, the atmosphere in the office felt strange, almost suspended in time. Though she tried to approach the farewell as just another professional transition, there was a weight in the air that made each of her movements feel denser, slower, as if even the building knew this would be the end of an era. For Emily, it was a constant struggle to stay focused while memories now surfacing with almost cruel clarity flooded her mind. Every conversation with Logan, every exchanged look, every silent moment they'd shared within those four walls. Logan, too, was in his office, but his rigid posture and impassive expression were a fragile facade. He was trying to convince himself he could get through the day without breaking down. But with each passing hour, the reality that this was the last time he'd see her moving through the office like she belonged there hit him harder. The promise he'd made to let her go had turned into a silent torment. Watching Emily wrap up the last details of her departure was a blow he could hardly withstand, and his grip on his emotions was fraying. By early afternoon, Emily decided to head to his office to deliver some final documents. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself as she walked down the corridor she'd traveled so many times, but this time each step felt like a goodbye. She knew Logan was trying to keep his emotions in check, and in a way, she was grateful. If they both broke down, the farewell would be even harder to bear. She knocked on his door and waited until he permitted her to enter. Logan looked up from the stack of papers on his desk, and when their eyes met, she noticed a restrained glimmer in his gaze. He nodded for her to approach, keeping a cold and professional demeanor, but the tension between them was almost tangible. "These are the final reports, and I made sure to review each one personally," she said, handing him the folder. Her voice came out controlled, almost too firm, and she worked to keep her composure, averting her gaze to avoid the intensity of his. He took the folder, placing it on his desk without opening it. "Thank you, Emily," he replied, his voice cold, but she could hear the effort it took to maintain it. "I know you've always done your job perfectly." They fell silent for a moment, and she felt the urge to leave, to end this conversation that only amplified the unspoken sadness between them. But before she could turn to go, Logan broke the silence. "Emily," he began, his voice softer than he intended. I really tried to keep this under control." He took a deep breath, as though gathering courage to continue. "But you have no idea how much this costs me. Every minute you spent here was more important to me than I ever admitted to even myself." Emily's heart raced, but she remained silent, waiting for him to go on. Logan turned to look out the window, as if trying to suppress the vulnerability rising within him. But the pain and sincerity in his expression were undeniable. "You were more than a colleague, Emily. From the beginning, you were someone who made me want to be better, someone who brought something to my life that I didn't even know I needed. And now you're leaving, and I'm trying to accept it, but it feels like something inside me is being torn away." He paused, and Emily saw a glimmer of emotion in his eyes. She opened her mouth to respond, but Logan didn't give her the chance. He took a step toward her, his intense gaze immobilizing her with the depth of what he was about to say. "Emily, I love you," he declared, his voice thick with raw emotion he could no longer hold back. "I love you, and no matter how hard I try to accept your departure, the thought of living without you destroys me." Emily felt the impact of his words hit her like a wave, and for a moment, the world seemed to disappear around them. His confession left her speechless, torn between the urge to stay and the certainty that she had to go. All her fears, the thought that he might only see her as a comfortable presence in the office, vanished in that moment. Logan loved her, and the sincerity in his words showed her he was willing to fight for what he felt, even if it was too late. "Logan," she began, but her voice trembled, and she had to look away to stop the tears threatening to fall. "You don't know how much it means to me, hearing you say that, but I also know I have to move forward. I need to discover who I am. I need to build something that's truly mine." He took a deep breath, absorbing her words, but he didn't step back. Instead, he took another step forward, closing the distance between them until they were only inches apart. Emily felt his presence, the warmth of his body, and her heart beat faster than ever, torn between what she wanted and what she knew she had to do. "Emily, I understand, but just tell me one thing," he whispered, his voice filled with both pain and hope. "Could you, someday, consider coming back to me?" His words were a plea, a final desperate request, and she felt her heart shatter upon realizing how willing he was to wait. Logan was not a man who admitted to failure or weakness, and here, in this silent declaration, he was giving her the truest part of himself. She looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears, and responded with a sad smile. "I don't know what the future holds, Logan, but know that you'll always have a special place in my heart, and if one day it feels right, I'll come back." That answer, though uncertain, seemed to be all he needed to hear. Without saying another word, Logan pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly as if trying to etch the feeling of having her close one last time. Emily closed her eyes, letting herself be enveloped by the warmth and security he offered, feeling a tear slip down her face. That embrace was the most painful farewell she'd ever experienced, but it was also a silent promise that, even apart, something between them would remain. When he finally let her go, they were both visibly shaken, but they knew there was nothing left to say. With one last look full of emotion, Emily took a step back, and without looking back, she walked out of his office. The door closed softly, and Logan remained there, alone, feeling empty yet somehow hopeful. That night, after leaving Brooks Tech and saying goodbye to Logan, Emily felt empty and exhausted, as if the farewell had drained every bit of her energy. She wandered aimlessly through the streets of New York, trying to process the decision she had made, but the doubts persisted, weaving themselves between Logan's words and her own desire to find her path. She needed advice, a perspective untangled from the complex web of feelings she had built over the years alongside him. She called Sarah, her longtime friend who had been with her since college. Sarah had always been her anchor, the voice of reason that helped her see situations clearly. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe, a place they often visited when they needed a break from the city's frantic pace. When Emily arrived, Sarah was already there, looking at her with a warm, understanding smile. Emily sat down, letting out a deep sigh, and for a moment, her emotional exhaustion kept her from saying anything at all. "Hey," Sarah said gently, reaching across the table. "I know you're dealing with a lot. Want to tell me what's going on?" Emily nodded, feeling a slight release in her chest knowing she was in a safe place to speak openly. "Sarah, I just don't know what to do," she began, her voice breaking. "I got a job offer in Boston, something I've waited for years to happen. This opportunity feels like exactly what I need to find myself, to be who I've always wanted to be. But now, there's Logan." She paused, struggling to organize her thoughts. Sarah watched her, patiently waiting. "Logan and we've gotten so close these past few months. He's someone who understands me in a way I never expected. I feel something so strong for him, but I'm also afraid. I'm afraid that if I stay, I'll lose myself. That I'll sacrifice everything I've worked for just to be by his side." Sarah nodded, fully grasping the complexity of Emily's dilemma. "I understand, Emily. It sounds like you're torn between a great love and a great dream. And sometimes, those paths seem incompatible, but you don't necessarily have to choose all or nothing. The most important thing is knowing what your heart truly wants." Emily felt the weight of Sarah's words and shook her head. "I love Logan, Sarah, I really do. But at the same time, I can't ignore this need to be more than someone who's just there to support him. I want my independence. I want to build something that's mine, something I can look at and say, 'This is who I am.'" Sarah observed her in silence for a few moments before speaking. "Emily, that's exactly what you should put first. Logan is important, and no one is telling you to ignore what you feel for him. But your dreams and your self-discovery are equally valuable. I've always admired your strength and ambition, your courage to want to build something for yourself. If Logan truly loves you, he'll understand." Emily nodded, but Sarah's words left her more reflective than ever. She realized she was afraid of disappointing Logan, of hurting him, or making him feel abandoned. However, she also knew there was something within her that demanded to be discovered. She needed to honor that desire, as she felt that without it, she'd end up living an incomplete version of herself. After a long silence, Sarah smiled softly and held her hand. "If there's one thing I can tell you, it's this. Love yourself first, Emily. Remember that to live a true love, you need to feel whole. Maybe this decision isn't an ending but a new beginning." Emily felt the weight of her friend's words, and a spark of understanding began to grow inside her. She didn't want to leave without at least giving herself a chance to discover who she truly was, to pursue a path she had only ever glimpsed from afar. She needed to be brave enough to put her self-love above her fear of losing Logan. The next morning, Emily woke up feeling calmer and more resolved. The conversation with Sarah echoed in her mind, and a rare clarity began to settle. There was something powerful and undeniable in her desire to move forward, to forge a path entirely her own, and she finally realized that the fear of regretting not trying outweighed the fear of losing Logan. Her feelings for him were still strong, but now she understood that if they ever met again, she wanted it to be as a complete woman with her own fulfillment to share. When she finally decided to move to Boston, Emily felt lighter, as if she had finally chosen for herself. She replied to the consulting firm, confirming that she would be available the following week for the first orientation meetings. It was a hard step, but at the same time, She felt a freedom and determination she hadn't experienced in a long time. In the days that followed, Emily began preparing for the move. She organized her belongings, said goodbye to friends, and dedicated time to herself, something she had neglected. She discovered new interests, started planning small trips and activities she had always put off. It was as if she was slowly building a renewed version of herself, someone who depended on no one but her own desire to grow and explore. But as she packed the last boxes, she couldn't help but glance at a small reminder of Logan, a letter he had written to her on her last day, an unexpected gesture that had left her speechless. She hadn't dared read the letter before, fearing his words might make her question everything again. But now, the letter felt like a necessary closure. With trembling hands, she opened it and began to read. "Emily, if you're reading this, then you're really leaving. I want you to know that there isn't a single part of me that doesn't respect and understand your decision. Every moment we shared made me realize how unique you are, someone with a quiet strength and clarity that I deeply admire. I've never loved anyone the way I love you, and if there's one thing I've learned from you, it's that true love is allowing someone to be free. I'll always be here, wherever you are, hoping that someday our paths cross again. But above all, I want you to know that I'm rooting for you. May you find everything you deserve and never stop being who you truly are. With all my love, Logan." His words struck her deeply, and the tears finally fell. Even in the most painful moment, Logan had shown his understanding and support. He wasn't trying to hold her back. On the contrary, he was showing that his love for her was strong enough to let her go. Emily's heart settled, and the certainty that she was making the right choice solidified even more. A few days later, as she boarded the plane to Boston, Emily carried with her the memory of Logan, but also a new purpose, a clarity that had come with choosing herself first. She knew that if they ever met again, it would be as two complete individuals, ready to build something real. Emily arrived in Boston feeling both conflicted and deeply satisfied with her decision to move forward and embrace a new chapter. The city welcomed her with the freshness of new opportunities, and as she explored her apartment and wandered the streets, she felt invigorated, as if every corner and building hinted at a bright future full of possibilities. Her new job at the consulting firm was stimulating and challenging, and for the first time, she experienced the autonomy and respect she had always craved. Yet, even with the excitement of her new life surrounding her, she couldn't shake the persistent absence. Logan. He occupied her thoughts in a way she tried to manage but couldn't ignore. Every time she overheard a phrase he might say, or saw something that reminded her of the moments they shared, her heart tightened. She knew he was also trying to move on, respecting the freedom she was exploring. Logan had been more understanding than she ever anticipated, which only deepened her affection for him. For Logan, life returned to work, but now his routine had an air of calm resignation. He maintained his usual facade, immaculate posture, and a mind focused on business. But to those who knew him well, and there were few, it was clear he had changed. When alone in his office, he allowed himself to feel the absence of Emily with an intensity that nearly overwhelmed him. Her space was empty, and each day he found himself trying to adapt to it. One evening, as he finished reviewing documents, Logan received a notification on his phone. It was a message from Emily. "Hi Logan, I hope everything's okay. I know this is sudden, but can I call you?" He didn't hesitate. His heart raced as he quickly typed a short response. "Of course, I'm here." Minutes later, his phone rang, and hearing her voice on the other end surrounded him with a mix of joy and longing. "Hi Logan," she began, trying to sound casual, but he detected the hesitation in her tone. "Hi Emily," he replied, his voice gentler than he intended. "How are you? How's Boston?" Emily smiled, picturing his expression. "Boston is amazing," she said sincerely. "The work is challenging, and I'm meeting new people. But it's hard not to think of you." Her confession caught him by surprise, and he fell silent, letting the words sink in. "I think of you every day," he replied, his sincerity unmistakable. "But I want you to know I'm happy for you, really happy, even if it means missing you." Emily felt a weight lift from his words, but she knew they needed to discuss something she had thought about deeply. Gathering her courage, she took a breath and continued. "Logan, I wanted to tell you that being here in Boston is good for me, but that doesn't mean I have to be away from you." He held his breath, waiting for her to go on. "I've been thinking a lot," she said carefully, "and I realized I can have my own life, my own path, without having to be apart from you. I want to try, Logan. I want to give us a chance, but with one condition." He listened in silence, his heart pounding at the weight of her words. "Any condition," he said with a soft, nervous laugh. "I'll do whatever it takes." Emily smiled, sensing that he truly understood the space she needed. "I want you to let me live my own life, Logan. I want to have my independence, my projects, my career. I need you to understand that this is important for me. And at the same time, I want us to be together without me losing who I am." Logan understood, perhaps more than ever. He knew this balance was what she had been searching for, and he realized that it was what he wanted as well. He loved her, but now he understood that loving her meant respecting her freedom. "I understand, Emily, and I accept with all my heart. I want you to have your life, your freedom. I don't want to be an anchor pulling you down, but someone who stands by your side, cheering for your success." Hearing those words, Emily felt a wave of relief and emotion wash over her, as if the final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. "Logan," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "that's all I needed to hear. I want to be with you. I want to build something real, but only if we can both be whole in this relationship." After the call, both felt renewed. There was a calmness surrounding their reconciliation, as if the time apart had allowed them to understand the importance of respecting each other's paths and individuality. In the days that followed, Emily felt a lightness, and the longing she felt for him now became a source of strength, pushing her to dive even deeper into her work and become the best version of herself. Logan, now assured that she had chosen him even from a distance, found peace in his routine. He knew she was doing something she loved, and his support for her from afar transformed into small daily messages, words of encouragement, and even occasional video calls to share simple moments, like morning coffee or the end of a long day. As the months passed, they both discovered that the distance, instead of weakening their bond, only strengthened it. Emily visited New York whenever she could, and Logan made a point to fly to Boston when his schedule allowed, and with each reunion, their love seemed to bloom even more, nourished by distance and mutual respect. Every meeting was a celebration, and each goodbye came with a renewed promise that, even apart, they were together in spirit and purpose. The decision to respect each other's space brought an unprecedented balance. Emily continued to excel in her career, taking on more responsibilities and building the reputation she had always dreamed of, while Logan found in her presence, even from afar, the motivation to pursue a balance that had previously eluded him. Once consumed by work, he discovered a newfound lightness, more willing to enjoy moments of peace and even plan trips and small breaks in his routine, something previously unthinkable. One evening, while they were talking over a video call, Logan smiled as he saw her lying on the sofa, looking tired, but with a joyful spark in her eyes. "You look exhausted," he commented with a tone of affection. "I don't think I've ever seen you work so hard." She laughed, brushing the strand of hair away. "I know, but you know what? It's a good kind of tired. For the first time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." He nodded, and even with the screen between them, they both knew that this feeling extended to them as well. "I'm so proud of you, Emily. More and more, every day." Emily smiled, reaching for the screen as if she could touch him somehow. And I'm grateful to you for understanding what I need, for giving me this freedom. I've never loved anyone like I love you, Logan." Her words, spoken with a serenity that only time and self-awareness could provide, filled his heart with immense joy. Logan knew that this reconciliation, rooted in respect and trust, was proof of how much they both had grown. She no longer needed to choose between her dreams and love, and he understood that loving someone often meant letting them be free. The distance, which had once seemed an obstacle, now became an invisible but unbreakable bond. 6 months after their decision to stay together while honoring their independence, Emily and Logan's relationship was stronger than ever, built on a solid foundation of respect, understanding, and mutual support. Each day spent apart, rather than weakening their bond, had only fortified it. Their connection no longer bore the weight of insecurities or doubts, just two people who grew closer by respecting their own dreams. Emily was thriving in Boston. The work at the consultancy was demanding, but the fulfillment she found in each achievement made her stronger and more confident. She had become a team leader, heading challenging projects with a level of success that both surprised and impressed her. And every professional milestone came with the knowledge that Logan, even from afar, was cheering her on. When moments of doubt crept in, a message of encouragement from him, a simple "You're incredible, Emily, don't ever forget it," was enough to renew her spirit. Logan, too, felt like a new man. For the first time, his life wasn't solely focused on business. He found joy in the simplest things, like spontaneous trips to Boston to see Emily or days of guilt-free rest where he allowed himself to disconnect from work. Her physical absence reminded him that love didn't need to exist within the confines of a shared space. He carried her with him, and she, with her accomplishments and independence, had become a constant source of inspiration. Their reunions became less about filling a void and more about celebrating everything they were accomplishing together. During one of these visits, on a quiet autumn night in Boston, they took a walk through the softly lit streets, holding hands and exchanging stories about their week, like old friends who were also lovers. In the glow of the street lamps, Logan stopped suddenly, gently pulling her close. "Emily, I don't know if I say it enough, but I'm the luckiest man alive to have you," he said, his eyes shining with a serenity she'd never seen in him before. She smiled, her heart full of tenderness. "Logan, you're part of this too. I don't know if I could have achieved so much without your support. You've always made me believe I could." He held her by the waist, looking at her with that deep gaze she knew well. "Because you can, and you always will. I've learned that love isn't about needing someone. It's about growing alongside someone you love and respect." She kissed him slowly, feeling the calm assurance that they were exactly where they were meant to be. The fears and doubts that had once haunted her had disappeared. What remained between them now was a bond of genuine connection. With Logan, she felt complete, knowing that her individuality and freedom remained intact, a mutual goal they'd both fought to preserve. Later that evening, as they sat on her sofa, sharing a glass of wine, Logan took a moment to look at her in silence. He'd been holding something in, but he knew that now was the right time. He set his glass down and took her hand. "Emily, we've talked so much about what we each need to be happy, about our dreams," he began, his voice gentle. "But I want to ask you something that, for me, feels like the right step to take now, knowing that you are exactly the person I want by my side." She looked at him with curiosity and affection, waiting for him to continue. Logan took a deep breath, his eyes showing a moment of hesitation before he collected himself. "I want to build a life with you, Emily, a life where we're partners, where we respect our spaces but face whatever comes our way together. So, how about we start thinking about that together? We can do it at our own pace, without any rush. But whenever you're ready, I want us to make this journey something even more special." Emily was silent for a moment, feeling the weight and beauty of his words. Logan wasn't just proposing a commitment. He was suggesting a life alongside her where they could both continue to grow. It was a promise of partnership, of love, and of freedom all at once. She smiled, her heart pounding with a serene certainty. "I couldn't imagine a future without you, Logan," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Yes, I want us to build this life together, honoring everything we've learned along the way." They embraced, sealing a silent promise of a love that was much more than passion. It was a mature love, built on the understanding that true companionship allowed them both to move forward, side by side, each whole and true to themselves. Over the years, Logan and Emily continued to build the relationship they both treasured. Their routine of visits and independence transformed into a perfect balance. Logan purchased a small apartment in Boston so they could spend more time together, and whenever possible, Emily traveled to New York to enjoy the city that held so many meaningful memories. What could have been a complication for other couples became an adventure for them, a constant reminder that love and freedom could coexist. In their work lives, each continued to achieve new milestones. Emily, promoted to an even higher leadership position, was regularly sought out for high-impact projects at the consultancy. Logan, inspired by the balance he found with Emily, began delegating more and even allowed himself to take vacations for the first time in years. Together, they traveled to new places, explored different cultures, and each new experience only deepened the love and understanding they shared. Their friends and family noticed the difference. Logan was lighter, happier, and less singularly focused on success. Emily, on the other hand, was a fulfilled woman, secure in herself and deeply content with her choice to follow her own path. Both knew that, no matter what the future held, they had found each other at a pivotal moment in their lives, and their love, rooted in freedom and respect, was one of the greatest accomplishments of their journeys. One spring afternoon, while walking through a park in New York, Logan stopped and looked at her with the same admiring gaze he'd always had. "Do you still want to follow our plan to do everything at our own pace, our own way?" he asked with a teasing smile. She laughed, holding his hand affectionately. "Always. Our way is what makes this so special." They walked together, laughing and planning their future, knowing they were exactly where they needed to be, together, yet free to be complete in themselves, in a relationship where dreams and ambitions had as much space as love.